Well, good evening, everyone. I'd like to call to order the 8th of December 2020 Committee of the Whole meeting. And I wish to acknowledge that the meeting is taking place on unceded Algonquin territories. I'd like to thank the Algonquin nations for hosting this meeting on their land. Moving to the next agenda item, approval of the agenda. Can I have a mover to approve the agenda? Hey, Rob, thank you. Are there any changes to the agenda?
Mr. Chair?
Yep.
My understanding, but I mean, it bears confirmation by staff, is that the hiring policy item might be more of an intended discussion than an action item at this time. But I refer you to staff.
I believe you're correct, and I think that's why Lynn had her hand up. She wanted to make a change to the agenda. Is that correct, Lynn?
That is correct, Mr. Chair.
Okay, so I'll turn it to you to advise on what the change should be.
Thank you for that. What I would propose is that we move item 7.2 regarding the equitable recruitment and hiring policy to be a discussion item under number 8 on the agenda, rather than leaving it as an action item for tonight. At the moment, there is reason to believe that the Minister of Education will extend the deadline somewhat for boards to approve their new hiring policies. And as far as I know, we still haven't seen the final policy and program memorandum on this from the ministry. We're still working from a ministry draft document. If we shift this as a discussion item, we would be able to begin the discussion tonight, and that would allow for the engagement of our non-voting representatives fully in that discussion. If necessary, and given that we have a pretty full agenda, we can also include it as a discussion and action if necessary item on the board agenda for next week, which should be a bit lighter, and which therefore would allow trustees a little more time to discuss this very important policy, having the comments of our Federation partners in particular in mind from tonight's meeting. So that's my proposal, Mr. Chair. I hope that we will know by the end of this week whether or not the deadline is being extended, but at least this gives us the opportunity for a more thorough discussion.
All right, thanks, Lynn. So I'd like to call the vote on the amended agenda. All those in favor? Okay, looks like most of those present are in favor. Any opposed? Lyra, are you voting?
I am opposing.
Or you're opposing? Okay, thank you. Thanks for clarifying. Okay, so one opposed, and the agenda as amended is passed. And so we'll move to briefing from the chair. Over to you, Lynn, for a briefing from the chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The holidays are fast approaching, and we all deserve a restful break. But we're asking everyone in our community to review the public health guidelines as part of their holiday planning. It's really important to keep ourselves and our loved ones safe, because unfortunately, COVID-19 continues to pose a serious threat to the community. It's recommended that families celebrate only with their own household members. And if you do interact with people outside your home, please wear a mask and keep a safe 2-meter distance. Also, if families travel outside the country, they will be expected to follow the Government of Canada's self-isolation policies on their return to Canada. And please also keep on following the daily screening for COVID-19, even when school resumes in January, because it is helping a lot. Secondly, as part of our continuing Indigenous speaker series, On December 11th at 1:30 p.m., we will be featuring presenter Kanahus Manuel. She will speak to grade 9 to 12 students and staff about current events taking place on Indigenous lands in British Columbia. The session will highlight the connections between colonialism and climate change, resource extraction, and violence against Indigenous peoples, and how students can play an important role in solidarity and action movements. The registration information for this session is on our website. And finally, the Ontario government is again providing some financial support for families. Parents or guardians residing in Ontario can receive a one-time payment of $200 for each child aged 0 to 12, or $250 if their child or youth is aged 0 to 21 with special needs. The application process will remain open until the 15th of January in 2021. To learn more and to fill out the simple application, please visit the Ontario Support for Learners webpage. And that's all in my briefing tonight. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks, Lynn. Are there any questions of the chair from trustees? All right, seeing no questions to the chair, move to the next agenda item, which is briefing from the director. Director, over to you.
Thank you, through you, Mr. Chair. The OCDSB will be celebrating coding activities during this year's Hour of Code, taking place on December the 7th to 13th. The Hour of Code started as a 1-hour introduction to computer science. It was designed to demystify coding, to show that anybody can learn the basics and broaden participation in the field of computer science. It has since become a worldwide effort to celebrate computer science. This grassroots campaign is supported by over 400 partners and 200,000 educators worldwide. Staff and students are encouraged to share their coding activities with us on social media. We will be hosting a speaker series on resilience with Dr. Robin Hanley-Defoe tomorrow night at 7 p.m. Dr. Hanley-Defoe is a multi-award-winning psychology and education instructor who specializes in resiliency, navigating stress and change, leadership, and personal wellness in the workplace. The session will provide practical strategies grounded in global research and case studies that help foster resiliency within others and ourselves. Further details can be found on our OCDSB website. It has come to our attention that the minutes of some of the advisory committee meetings have not consistently recorded the attendance of Trustee Blackburn. We apologize for the oversight, and we will amend the minutes to ensure Trustee Blackburn's attendance is reflected in the same manner other trustees who are not appointed members of the committees. And finally, on Thursday, December the 10th, it's the first day of the Jewish celebration of Hanukkah. We'd like to wish peace and joy to all of those in our communities who are celebrating. And that's all for my report, Mr. Chair.
All right, thanks, Director. Are there any questions to the director? All right, seeing no questions, we'll move to the next agenda item, which is item number 5, delegations. And we'll move to item 5.1, which is a delegation from Ann Boys and Lark Barker from Decoding Dyslexia. Ann, Lark, if you're ready and able to start your presentation, you have 4 minutes.
Hi, this is Lark. I'm just checking if Ann is on the meet. Maybe I'll just start for us. I'm not sure if there's some technical difficulties. Hello, and thank you for this opportunity to raise awareness about the barriers students with dyslexia are facing during pandemic learning. We want to start by acknowledging the incredible work of teachers to keep students safe and engaged with learning during this very difficult time. Decoding Dyslexia Ontario is a voluntary, grassroots, parent-led group that advocates for Ontario Public Schools to identify dyslexia early and adopt evidence-based curriculum so that all students learn to read. I am chairperson of Decoding Dyslexia, a parent from Toronto, a special education specialist with the TDSB, and obviously a parent of dyslexic children. Dyslexia is a neurobiologically based, often inherited learning disability that makes it difficult, but not impossible to read, write, and spell. In the DSM-5, dyslexia is described as an alternative term used to refer to a pattern of learning difficulties characterized by problems with accurate or fluent word recognition, poor decoding, and poor spelling abilities. Dyslexia not only affects reading, we see difficulties with attention, processing speed, working memory, executive functioning skills, and anxiety around reading and other areas of learning. Dyslexia is the most common LD, and there will be at least 2 students in every classroom with dyslexia. When evidence-based reading instruction, support, and accommodations are provided, most students will learn alongside their peers and achieve their full potential. Without support, they face poorer outcomes compared to neurotypical students. Last winter, thousands of parents provided heartbreaking testimony about their challenges to the Ontario Human Rights Commission Right to Read inquiry. Our students are at higher risk for suspension, bullying, mental health challenges, and dropping out of school. We know that children who don't learn to read well go on to struggle with reading for their entire lives, and as adults, they have higher rates of unemployment and underemployment, homelessness, and incarceration. There is mounting evidence from the University of Alberta, the Ontario Human Rights Commission, the Learning Disabilities Association, the AODA Act, and here in your hometown with the OCDSB's Back to School survey, that this pandemic is further exacerbating existing educational barriers for students with dyslexia and other learning and attention differences in 3 main ways. So 1, that it's ever widening the learning gap between dyslexic and neurotypical students. 2, it's increasing emotional stress around learning. And 3, it's placing an additional burden on families in the sense of financial and emotional toils. During the pandemic, we have heard regularly from parents that in addition to adapting to pandemic life, their children face barriers to learning such as difficulty getting accommodations, difficulty accessing learning support teachers. There are not enough one-on-one support, difficulty keeping up just with work assignments due to the quadmester system and accelerated learning, inaccessible technologies and materials that are really structured for online learning, and lack of communication between schools and families combined with this lack of support is placing heavy onus on parents to support their children. This is impacting learning and emotional well-being. In the OCDSB survey, many students who identified as having learning and attention issues reported feeling, and I'm going to quote, stupid and dumb. And parents described their learning experience as, quote, soul crushing, with their learning needs being tragically ignored. I know that time is limited and I wanted to check in with the board. Is my time complete?
Yes, it is.
I don't know if there are any questions. I think just to speak off the record, there is a way forward. I'm sure your board is aware of the Ontario Human Rights Right to Read Commission, and they will be coming out with recommendations in the spring as the result of their inquiry. I think that a lot of research should be done around why the OHRC has got involved, the steps that led there, and what your board will think the outcomes will be and how that will impact your students and teacher training.
Thanks, Lark. I want to thank you for your presentation. As, you know, when I was a young student, I had many of the things that you spoke about in your remarks, and if they had a name for it back then, it probably would have been called dyslexia. So I want to thank you for your presentation and for really raising this issue to the level that it needs to be discussed. We do have 2 questions tonight. one from student trustee Liu and another one from trustee Boothby. And student trustee Liu, I'll go to you first.
First of all, just thank you again for bringing these issues to our attention. And it is a failure on the part of all of us as a board of trustees for not being proactive and ensuring that these equity issues are being handled. So, and also just a quick note for all the other trustees here, I would encourage you to read her full delegation and her full statement in the agenda. Anyways, so my question for you would be, would you say that ensuring that teachers are providing support and following IEPs, would that be the most useful solution in your eyes?
That's a great question, because I think you're asking about a solution. And so is it a solution focused during pandemic learning, or a greater solution in general to these barriers that existed prior but have been exacerbated? I think just if we're looking at pandemic learning, I think there is, yes, the following of the IEPs around accommodations. I think it's been difficult for students or for teachers to access prior IEPs with the SAP management system where teachers input IEPs, especially if there's virtual learning, having access to student OSRs can be difficult. Some of the 5 things that we have here are: ensure that students receive effective reading instruction, both in person and virtually. Ensure that students receive the accommodations, as you mentioned. Strengthen the relationship between families and educators to help navigate pandemic learning. Turn technology challenges into advantages, and give the teachers knowledge they need to succeed. So 2 of those nuggets really go back to curriculum, and this is what the Ontario Human Rights Commission is going to come out with some recommendations on, probably. I think the other ones will be, as you mentioned, looking at the IEP, understanding each student's report. Teachers have to write them, and then asking as well, what would those accommodations look like?
That's great. Thanks, Ms. Barker. So for the next question, we'll go to trustee Boothby.
And thank you for coming with your presentation. And my question was essentially what trustee Liu's was, so I won't keep you any further, but thank you for bringing this attention and the suggestions in your very thorough delegation.
I think if I could just make one final closing remark, it really is just around the systemic ableism and barriers that students with dyslexia faced. You will all hear the results of the Ontario Human Rights Commission inquiry, and I would be happy to send your board probably my top 4 reading articles, just that you could get some background information around this, so that you have a little bit of a deeper understanding before the OHRC recommendations come out, sort of what is the real issue here, why is it an issue, and how has the Ontario Human Rights Commission got involved.
Thank you very much.
Yeah,
welcome.
thanks, Mrs. Barker. I'm sure the trustees would appreciate that, and so would staff. So thank you for your delegation tonight. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
So with that, we'll move on to item number 6, which is the COVID-19 update, and I will turn to the director for the update.
Thank you, Chair, and through you. As of today, the OCDSB has 36 active student cases of COVID-19 and 3 active staff cases with 2 closed classes. The district has a total of 229 resolved cases. The commitment of families and staff to follow public health guidelines and school safety precautions has been instrumental in keeping the numbers low in our district. Ottawa Public Health has advised that a review of student index cases shows that students are typically exposed at home, parents are tested first, and many students are asymptomatic or experience mild symptoms. This reiterates the importance of isolation while household results are pending. The OPH review of staff index cases reinforces the importance of appropriate, consistent use of all PPE, medical mask, visor, and physical distancing, no eating, drinking, carpooling together, staff room limits, staying home and getting tested for even mild symptoms, reducing staff working at multiple sites, and keeping a log of times and classes that staff enter. 1 week ago, the OPH ran a pop-up test site hosted by Ottawa Public Health on Sunday at Mannerdale Public School. There were 230 tests administered on Sunday, and we have been advised that all the test results are in. 226 tests were negative. There was one positive result, and that positive result is not related to the school. Communications leading to the holiday break. As we approach the winter break on December the 18th, we continue to reinforce the messaging from Ottawa Public Health around the importance of following safety guidelines. We know how much families like to gather at this time of year, and we also know that efforts to reduce the spread of COVID-19 require our collective commitment. We say it takes a community. And the commitment to stay the course and refrain from gathering with persons outside of the household. District communication will focus on the importance of a safety first season and ensuring readiness for school reopening in January. We're also working on messaging and sharing of available resources and supports for families in need during the school closure period. I would like to extend my own sincere thanks to all of our staff and the tremendous amount of work that they have done to activate and to carry out the expected protocols to ensure that our schools and our students are indeed safe. That's all for my report, Chair.
Great. Thanks, Director. Are there any questions to the Director and her update this evening? Lynn?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wondered if the director could comment on the impact on learning and teaching in our schools that we're seeing right now. I mean, we've just finished a reporting period, and it certainly is of interest to us as a board to know how things are going from the point of view of student learning.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Chair. Certainly an important question, one that we have been asking ourselves. So we have started to pull the data to try to look at what the patterns are, and there are multiple things to consider. So not only are we considering some of the impacts of the protocols that are in place that create different learning conditions, we are also looking at the impact of, in our secondary schools, having a quadmester or an octomester structure, and we are looking at the impact of the virtual learning piece. We do not have any categorical answers to give at this point, nor are we prepared to draw any conclusions from what we can see. What we're seeing so far are some positive trends pertaining to the securing of credits, and so successful credit attainment. But we're careful about drawing conclusions prematurely about looking at that data in just plain ways. We are meeting as a team on Friday morning to address and to assess some of what we're seeing now. But we do know that there's far more to the impact than just the numbers and the data that we see in report cards. We do know anecdotally that there has been an impact on the conditions to support well-being. And we do know that there is a different kind of impact on students in elementary school as in secondary school based on developmental needs. We also do know that our teachers have been incredibly inventive around how it is to continue reaching students in a variety of different ways. And we can see that as the senior team and myself have been present in schools and in classrooms to see some of the very creative solutions firsthand. So I can say that there certainly has been an impact. It has been a very different fall. But the nature of the impact is difficult to deduce at this time. And the conundrum that we will face is that for some students, this has in fact been a very productive time. And for other students who have been productive in the past, have experienced some very significant difficulties, whether it's because of the way that they're learning or because of the emotional strains on family and on themselves with this change. So that's the best answer I can give at this point, Trustee Scott, and through you, Mr. Chair.
Great.
Thank you very much for that.
Thanks, Director. We have one more question from Trustee Boothby.
Thank you. And I'm just wondering, since many of our students over the Christmas holiday probably will be putting in applications for university, do we have any information on how universities are accepting student applications, and are there any changes or difficulties given what we're going through right now? Or do we know, are they moving application deadlines? Any information that we have? Thank you.
Thank you, Trustee Boothby, and through you, Mr. Chair. We haven't had explicit information shared with us at this point around the changing of deadlines. We do know that last year at this time, or last year, it would have been earlier this year, we did have that collaboration with our universities around timelines and so forth, because they are understanding of the reality. So to the trustee's question, we haven't had an explicit extension, but what we have had is a commitment of collaboration. And so we certainly will provide updates as soon as we receive them in terms of something that is concrete.
Thank you.
Great, thanks, Director. So moving on to the next agenda item, we'll move to item number 7, which is matters for action. And I'll call on the Director to introduce a report concerning the new Half Moon Bay Elementary School, which is report 20-081 and is agenda item 7.1. Director, over to you.
Thank you through you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to call on CFO Carson to share the report and respond to the questions as trustees have them. CFO Carson.
Mr. Chair, I think we'll go straight to Ms. Ostafchuk, our Manager of Planning. She and Mr. LaBelle have prepared the report, and they can take you through it.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, through you. The report before you seeks approval of a consultation plan for a process to establish the boundary, the opening grade structure and ultimate grade structure, and the program offerings for a new school to be constructed in Half Moon Bay. We were very pleased to learn in the summer, in July, that we had received funding from the Ministry of Education for the construction of a second elementary school in the Half Moon Bay community. The school is to be built to accommodate up to 674 pupils. And at the moment, although we are not to be quoted on this just yet, we are tentatively scheduled to be completed in time for a September 2022 opening. We actually own the site upon which the school will be built. It's a 2.83 hectare site, which is about 7 acres. It's located on the southwest corner of Kilburney Drive and River Mist Road. The actual Appendix A to the report shows you the location. The whole of the Half Moon Bay development area in Barrhaven is fairly well defined, and there have been a number of housing starts there. Building permits have been consistent, and it's building out quickly. Ultimately, there's supposed to be something in the order of 8,600 homes in that particular area. The first Half Moon Bay Public School was opened in 2016. And it is the first of 3 planned for the area. So this second funded school is the second to be built. Currently at Half Moon Bay Public School, we have 10 portables, and projected enrollment is to be over 900 students. This was obviously impacted by the pandemic, but as things come back to normal, we know that it's far over capacity at 6. It also has a capacity of 674 pupils, and at over 900, we know that it cannot sustain. We do need to have that second school built to alleviate some of the pressure. So we were pleased, as I said, to get that funding to try and keep pace as much as possible with the growth. As I noted, the Half Moon Bay residential community is fairly well defined. The OCDSB has, as much as possible with every new growth community, we've tried very, very hard to have a very logical look at the boundaries we're setting. And that certainly happened with Half Moon Bay Public School. When we went forward with the community to go ahead and set that boundary, we did it with a mind to creating a boundary that would eventually calve off to this next school. So we're hoping that rather than involving a whole bunch of schools and a whole bunch of communities, this will be a fairly straightforward process, geographically anyhow. And we think, we hope that it will be a fairly logical thing. It's what we do in most growth areas. We've done it in Fernbank, for example. That was the latest one that you might have come across. So even though we typically have an advisory committee made up of representatives from the community and from impacted schools, in this case, there are 3 community associations we think should be invited and are impacted: Half Moon Bay, Barhaven West, and Stonebridge. So they will be invited to be at the table. And then the schools involved are Half Moon Bay Public School and Cedarview Middle School at the moment. As always, with timelines, with participants, we can add and subtract as that is necessary if it is deemed necessary. We think this one will be a fairly tight group. We've always had good discussions face-to-face with these advisory committees, and that is done to sort of narrow options and refine recommendations as much as we can, going forward to a very broad public meeting where we get the broadest possible input. And that is brought back to you as board as you are adopting recommendations with regard to that boundary and grade structure. This year, of course, we'll be doing it virtually. We have had some experience with this virtual consultation, and we do think that it will work well. We have included the timelines in the report because we hope this is a good news story. It's always great to be building a new school, and we hope the geography is well enough defined. We do think that if this report is approved and recommended to board and ultimately approved, we do think that it is reasonable within this school year to have that boundary and grade structure set. So we plan, if all goes well, to come back to you with recommendations before the end of this school year. So as I said, our report this evening seeks approval of the consultation plan to begin this important process. And even though time is a bit on our side, I know that the community is anxious to know where we're going forward. And they often have a lot of input. Well, the geography may be straightforward. There will always be questions of grandparenting of siblings and what programs are offered and that sort of thing. So we think to have a fulsome discussion, if we begin this now, it would be most prudent. So I'll leave it at that. And I'm with my colleague, Mark LaBelle is with us tonight. And so if you have any questions, we'll endeavor to answer. Thank you.
It's great. Thanks, Karen. Great update. Great to see you again. I see one hand from Trustee Scott, and I presume she wants to move and perhaps ask a question. Lynn, over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would first of all like to say how much I appreciate a very succinct and clear report on this. I know that from our work around the Stonecrest consultation to set the boundaries for Stonecrest, which involved a lot more schools, it still was a very together kind of process. And the idea of rational boundaries makes just a huge amount of sense. Many of you may not realize this, but technically speaking, by a matter of several meters at least, this school site is actually in Zone 1. And whether it will still be in Zone 1 by the time that it is built and opened is another question, given the city's review of the ward boundaries. But for now, at least, I'm very happy to move the recommendation on page 3 of the staff report 20-081 to affirm that the pupil accommodation review is not required for this study, and to approve the timeline and consultation plan as presented in the report.
That's great. Thanks, Lynn. Are there any speakers to the motion, to the recommendation? Okay, seeing no speakers. Unmute would be a starter. Since I don't see any speakers to the recommendation, I'll move the call to vote on the recommendation. All those in favor? Okay, any opposed? Okay, seeing no opposed, the recommendation passes. Thanks, Lynn. And thanks for the update, Karen. So let's move to the next item, which is item 7.3 on the agenda, which is report 20-084, development of a human rights policy. And I will turn to the director to introduce the report.
Thank you. Through you, Chair. I believe we deferred that item to discussion item in 8.0.
My mistake, Director. I had highlighted the one above it. So my mistake. I'll backtrack. So let's move to item 7.2, which is report 20-103, which is the high performance athletic program. And I'll turn to you to introduce the report and to Superintendent Lehman, I presume.
Thank you, and through you, Chair. So I will turn the report directly to Superintendent Lehman to introduce and guide trustees through the report. And he is, of course, prepared to respond to questions. Superintendent Lehman.
Good. Through you, Chair. Thank you, Director. I do have a few slides in order to guide our conversation this evening and the highlights of the report. So I am going to share my screen here. Okay. So, sorry. And okay. All right. So the purpose of the report is to present findings on the OCDSB high performance athletic consultation. And it's also to seek approval of the recommendations concerning the future of the program. So you will remember, I hope, at our meeting of October 1st, 2019, at Committee of the Whole, trustees passed a motion directing staff to commence the activities outlined in the policy and procedure around changes to programs and program delivery structures at secondary schools with a view to phasing out the HPA program at John McCrae effective September 2021. So we engaged in a consultation plan, or engaged in a consultation. Before we get to the consultation and the highlights, I just wanted to share a few things related to the history of the program. So the High Performance Athletic Program was created about 30 years ago or so. And initially it was connected at Confederation. It was born as a result of students that were training at Nepean Sportsplex, which is right beside Confed. And it mainly supported students in skating, swimming, and hockey. When Confed closed in the mid-90s, the program was then moved and transferred to John McCrae Secondary School, in large part due to the proximity of Walter Baker. And the program has remained there since that time, so we would be about 25 years. And from a demographic point of view, you know, the high numbers in the program achieved about 240 in grades 9 through 12 at one point. And this year there are 110 students in the program. So what is the HPA program? It is an opportunity for high-level athletes in grades 9 to 12 to achieve their academic and athletic goals while balancing training and competition. That's achieved in sort of three main areas. One is working with a dedicated coordinator as well as a guidance counselor who supports both short-term and the long-term academic timetables and goals of individual students. Also, it is the ability to have a flexible learning schedule and modification connected to course assignments. as well as assessment, exams, etc., related to the training and competition needs. And it also involves the use of technology and digital technology. And up until this year, I would say would be something that would be a bit unique, but as we're all aware that as of this year, it is much more common practice. The other sort of components to the program is that there are some congregated classes in the HPA program. So this year there are 10 sections that are running at the school with about 14 courses. And so there are some combined courses in those sections. Those congregated courses begin in grade 10. And as you can see, they are connected with science, math, English, and social sciences. So the HPA program does have entrance criteria, and students in grades 8 through 11 may apply from across the jurisdiction. And we do have some students that also do apply from out of board. As you can see on the screen, the criteria is outlined as follows. So applicants must either be competing or have the opportunity to compete at the provincial level or higher in their respective sport. They must train and compete in their respective sport a minimum of 14 hours per week. And then there's a portfolio as well when the students are entering into the program, of which they must include within that package that is provided to the HPA coordinator. Students don't necessarily need to come into the program at grade 9. Obviously, it would be a natural transition point, but we do have students that do come into the program at other grade levels as well in secondary school. I mentioned a little bit earlier about program demographics, and this year there are 110 students enrolled in the program. There would have been approximately 125. There are 14 students that either deferred their entry into the program by going to OCD or were previously in the program and had moved to Ottawa-Carleton virtual. There are 21 students that are represented. A very small percentage number of the enrollment comes from outside of their jurisdiction, meaning outside of Ottawa. We tend to have anywhere from 2 to 5 students on any given year. And again, the numbers have dropped consistently within the program over the last 5 years, from 225 to 110 this year. It's also important to note that approximately 40 to 50% of the students in the program in any given year are connected to John McCrae, the shared boundary between John McCrae and South Carleton, or are connected with the Longfields Davison catchment area. We do know that there are certainly some enrollment pressures at John McCrae Secondary School. It was a school that was built for just under 1,000 students, and the projected enrollment this year was 1,391, and there are 15 portables that are currently on the school grounds. So the consultation, we did it in 2 phases. We did some consultation in June, and then the second part of our consultation was in October. In June, we ran 2 focus groups with OCDSB school administrators, and we gathered some information from our school administrators that weren't connected to John McCrae. And then we also met with a group of parents that had a student in the HPA program, or formerly had a student in the HPA program. The second part of the June consultation was a thought exchange that was held with John McCrae staff. So we had staff respond that were connected to the HPA program and that were not, and then students that were connected with the HPA program. So I'll just give a bit of a highlight here around from the June consultation. So these were the things that were working based on the information that we received back. So a big one that you saw in the report was around the flexibility around the schedules. In some cases, we have students that would be away for weeks, or in some cases months on end. And in some cases that doesn't necessarily happen. But for the students that needed that, the flexible scheduling and deadlines certainly was really critical. The program felt that the program was well organized, supportive, and that the teachers were understanding. One of the big ones from the certainly students as well was congregating in the same setting and being in class and working with students that had similar goals and were able to sort of understand each other. The location was positive in respect to this group, and that certainly teachers and the HPA coordinator or the guidance counselor who was very familiar with the student athletes. What we heard around what could be improved was for teachers that were not connected with the program to have a bit of a better understanding, more HPA classes being offered. So I talked earlier about those congregated classes where HPA members were only in those classes, and around stricter requirements to enter and remain in the HPA program. The October survey, I'm happy to share that we had 1,310 respondents, which was fantastic. We weren't necessarily sure what type of numbers that we were going to get. And that included 950 parents, 160 students, about 140 educators. We had 23 coaches and 36 community members. So a really good number. So it was sort of broken down into, I think, of 4 areas that we're highlighting. One, again, is around admission criteria. So again, sort of some mixed messages here that students and parents that were involved in the HPA were generally satisfied with the criteria. Well, staff had felt that it did not meet the needs of high-level athletes and felt that it should be strengthened. And you can see that 60% of students and 32% of parents that weren't associated with the HPA program, but attending John McCrae indicated that stricter admission criteria was required, and that parents and students not involved in HPA or from other schools didn't feel that they knew enough about the program in order to be able to comment on it. Again, as was mentioned in the June feedback, the concept or the theme around flexibility for students is a real critical theme around timetabling, the demonstration of learning, how they're doing that, the ability to be able to connect one or more cooperative education credits to their training and competition, supervised by their coach, as well as connected to obviously a cooperative education teacher at the school, and then the experience of the staff in working with student athletes and being able to understand their needs. Sort of connected with the last one around a dedicated team. So I've talked about the HPA coordinator who supports students in the scheduling of their courses, really sort of being a liaison and a go-between sometimes between teachers and students, though, students do self-advocate. The coordinator certainly does some work here as well in trying to maneuver and support where the students need to get to, and having the students also, understand the rigors and the needs of courses and school programs. Working with teachers who understand the demands of being placed on student athletes. So I talked a little bit about that earlier as well, and that HPA courses where students had felt supported by their peers. So that's a big one that keeps coming up as well. A majority of the individuals felt that the JMSS sort of felt the location being at John McCrae Secondary School met their needs. A number of individuals not attending John McCrae Secondary School felt that there should be programs outside of John McCrae for more students to access. So as a result of the engagement of our consultation, and what we heard, and there is not a great body of research around this, unfortunately, and that there certainly is a need to apply the skills and characteristics that contribute to the success of high level athletes, regardless of the school. And so, again, no surprise that this includes flexibility in student learning opportunities, an educator that's dedicated to support the academic and athletic goals of the student, and then learning models that would support and enhance the student learning experience. So We are recommending that the program continue at John McCrae as we develop a diversified approach in supporting the high-level needs of students in all schools. This may include students being able to remain at their home school. It may include engaging in some digital learning and being in a congregated setting or a combination thereof. We know that we are currently engaged in lots of digital learning at this point in time. We understand that, that certainly is something that we would be exploring. And in particular, we would like to engage with the 14 students that were going to come into the HBA program but chose not to. They went to Ottawa-Carleton virtual this year in order to obtain some additional information based around what their experience has been like. And it would be really interesting as well to hear from their experiences if they had previously attended the HBA program as well. Our goal would be to create a framework to support all high-level athletes across the district in meeting their athletic and academic goals, regardless of where or how they're learning. And this will ensure equity of access and opportunity for all students, regardless of where they reside. As I said earlier, the number of students who reside in the John McCrae and LDH area, as well as that South Carleton shared area, is approximately to 40 to 50% of the population that is in the HPA program. And by looking at the discontinuation of the program, it would slightly reduce some enrollment at JMSS, roughly between 15 and 20 students potentially per year over the course of a 4-year period. There's also some consideration of the building of the new school in Riverside South and how that may adjust the boundaries of LDH and John McCrae and alleviate some of the pressures there as well. So as our next steps, as outlined in the report, would be to obtain more specific information concerning high-level athletes attending their community schools and how that they're being supported, to identify and communicate those delivery options that support the academic and athletic needs of students, for frameworks to support the needs of high-level athletes in all schools to be developed, keeping in mind unique circumstances, to review admission requirements to ensure rigor of program and equity of access for all students. And one of the things that we've heard as well is around to develop a process for monitoring the status of the students in the program. And then based on where, our work and the direction of the board takes us would be to look at the HPA coordinator's job description to make sure that it would be aligned with a diversified approach moving forward. And then finally to improve communication about the HPA program, the opportunities, how we support students, whatever road that takes us down. And finally, the recommendations that are in the report are in front of you at this point. So, Mr. Chair, I present this report and I'm happy to take any questions.
That's great. Thanks, Superintendent Lehman. Sean, as a start, you might want to move your mic up a bit. I think it's rubbing on the lapel of your shirt, which is causing a lot of feedback.
Sorry.
Others.
Thank you.
And I see a number of questions. And then just from a time management perspective, I know that trustees will want to weigh in on the human rights policy. And I know trustees will want to talk about the equitable recruitment and hiring policy. So let's be smart with our questions right now. So to afford us the time for those other items. And so with that, I'll go to our first question, which is from Trustee Penny, and then Trustee Boothby, Scott, and Trustee Ellis next.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to move the recommendation onto the floor. And I do have some questions for Superintendent Lehman at the same time as part of my introduction. And I would urge my fellow trustees to support this and to also take an equity lens to the program as well. In reviewing the data, this program is highly inequitable as far as from a geographic perspective, where I can see that less than 5% of the attendees for this program come from east of the Rideau Canal, which begs the question why that is. And I can see that doing an OC Transpo survey, I see it takes 2 hours to get from John McCrae, from my house to John McCrae. So that's why no students are going to attend this. So I don't see why we can't support high-level athletes, no matter what school they go to, so they don't have to leave their home school. I see that, you know, getting congregated classes is a very positive thing, so that students can congregate together. But let's say a student doesn't want to leave their home school. And so I applaud the effort of Superintendent Lehman and the staff to bring this together. And I would hope that they could, you know, it's not a huge effort and they could get something done as soon as possible. And thank you very much.
Great. I took those more as comments. Keith, was there a question in there, or are they just really commentary?
Just commentary. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So we have the recommendation on the floor, and I'll move to Trustee Boothby next.
Thank you. And I just have a couple of questions. My first question is, so we see that there's been a pretty significant drop from over 200 to about 110 over the last 5 years. Did we query that?
Yes, through you, Chair. Thanks for the question, Trustee Boothby. One of the things that has occurred here is that the school has tightened up the criteria. And in speaking with the former HPA coordinator, the current HPA coordinator and school administrative team, is that I guess what I can say is that the school is being more vigilant around the criteria for entrance into the program. And as a result, there have been less numbers that have been coming forward and less numbers that have been approved.
Okay, thanks for that. So the athletes that are in this program, once they get in, assuming that they get in at grade 9, is it an automatic to grade 10, grade 11, grade 12, assuming they stay in the athletic program they're in, or do they have to discreetly reapply each and every year?
Through you, Chair, they do not have to reapply every year. So if they enter in grade 9 based on successful entrance with the criteria, and they would remain in the program for every year thereafter.
Okay, thank you. And so say a student is in it in grade 9 and 10 and then decides for whatever reason that they're no longer applying for that. Are they redirected back to their home school, or is there a provision, since they've already been there for 2 years or potentially 3 years, they would be allowed to stay?
So through you, Chair, in a case where if a student has been there for a year, so let's say they enter in grade 9, they no longer want to take part in the program, and that happens. I did ask the HPA coordinator about that. And then what would happen in that case generally is the student would return back to their home school. Transportation would not be provided then. Now, if it's a situation where a student maybe has been there 2 or 3 years, the family and the student could apply for a cross-boundary transfer, and depending upon the circumstances, you know, there would be some consideration provided, though that is a zero cap school because of the enrollment pressures. There is always the opportunity to apply for that and for us to review those.
Okay, thank you. And my last question, it's not clear to me with the recommendation in Part A particularly, that staff develop a plan to diversify our approach. It's not clear to me if we approve this recommendation and staff comes back to us in the spring with a recommendation, that we're almost de facto saying that this program can go away if we approve the recommendation before us today, without it needing to come back expressly to trustees to say, we're discontinuing the program at John McCrae and we're going to do XYZ at all schools.
Through you, Chair, in response to the question, our intent was that we would go away to do the research as outlined in the next steps, and then we would come back with that plan around diversifying the approach, and whatever that approach may entail. So it may entail 3 or 4 different types of things to be able to meet the profiles of student athletes and high-level athletes across the district. And that may include where the program, a congregated program remains, or maybe it doesn't remain. That really depends on, I think, the work that we do when we go back away. I might ask either Director Williams-Taylor to comment on that, or maybe the executive officer, just based around how the recommendation is outlined there.
Director?
Thank you. I'm happy to comment on that, and through you, Mr. Chair. So indeed, Trustee Boothby, the result could be that the program is grandfathered out, although that isn't the intent that has been articulated in the recommendation. Our intent here in the recommendation is to focus on the service to the profile of the student, as opposed to focusing on whether a program should exist or not. And so you will hear from the results of the work that has been done to understand the needs of the students and the families of the students, that our focus here was to really understand, are we serving these students effectively? And is it a program that is required, or is it a service model that is required throughout the district? And so the recommendation that you see before you focuses on an interrogation into a service model, and that may result in either a confirmation of a dual approach, which is a program, a structured program, and a diversified program, or that a diversified program with opportunities through a virtual platform might be the way to go. So I will bring trustees back to the strategic action plan, which is around modernizing our programs in the interest of high expectations and serving our students. And that is where we have focused this. So the end of the answer would be that indeed the result could be that the program is deemed redundant, if you will, because the service is being offered in a different way.
And that decision would come back to trustees for approval. Okay,
Yes.
thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. That's all my questions.
All right, great. Thanks, Christine. So next we have Lynn, Chris, Lyra, and then Sandra. I'm just mindful of the time and the other substantive items we have on the agenda tonight. And so I'll turn to Lynn next for your question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll start with the easy question. It was great to have the results of the thought exchange summarized in one of the appendices for the students and staff at McRae. But what I didn't see was a comparable summary of the feedback that came in from the 1,300 people who responded to the other survey. Will we be able to have a summary of that feedback with similar detail before the board meeting next week?
Through you, Chair, we will certainly work on getting that for the trustees. Chair Scott.
Thank you very much for that. And now for the hard question. We've heard a lot of reference from time to time about what is a program, what is an accommodation. The director has just made reference to service models in her comments just a moment ago. What I would really like to have some understanding of is, when we talk about this as a program, and I know that there are some definitions of these things that we put into our secondary framework policy years ago, but when we really stop and think about what is a program and what is an accommodation and what is a service model, what are we really talking about? And is it time that we looked at those definitions and really started to think about what this particular program is?
So, sorry, through you, Chair. Thanks for the question, Lynn. You're right. It's not an easy question by any means. I think that it might be an opportunity for us to take a look at the secondary program framework, and based on how we have defined and how we have identified programs. this is an opportunity for us to, I think, go back and to certainly review things that, characteristics and skills that, people feel certainly that we should be seeing in every environment and in every setting. And so, there are certainly stories of and circumstances where these things are occurring and where these accommodations are taking place. But to get back to sort of your question is, I think it would be an opportunity for us to have an opportunity to, revisit the framework because, in essence, these are pieces where when we look at the secondary framework, it talks about the entrance requirements. And, that district programs usually have an entrance requirement. And so, I guess that's one of the pieces that we might have to undertake and go back and do some review on to see if this program and other types of programs as such should actually be part of that, or if it just should be a part of the way that we do education across the district.
Thank you for that. And I do have one more question, and that is, we've had a number of athletes who are students with special needs who have competed in things like Special Olympic type programs and so on. Does the program at McRae serve athletes with special education needs, significant special education needs?
Through you, Chair, to the best of my knowledge, it does not serve students with significant special education needs. The program does not.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
That's great. Is that it, Lynn?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. Keith, I still see your hand up. I don't know if that's, if you have another question. I'll move on to Trustee Ellis next, and then Trustee Schwartz.
Thank you. This survey that Trustee Scott mentioned, was information from that used by staff to come up with the assumptions in this report?
Through you, Chair. Yes, Trustee Ellis, it was. So those 1,310 responses that came from parents, they came from students, staff, coaches, and community members. It was the second part of the consultation feedback that was used to come up with our next steps and recommendations.
So they're reflected in the graphics that in this report?
They are reflective. I'm just going to go to the report. And they are reflective beginning in page 4. So
page 4 of the report?
Yeah.
Folio?
Yeah, page 4 of the report. So,
so on page 5, we see some of the graphics.
Mm-hmm.
They're included in these graphics?
Yes, they are.
Okay. The significant number, what, 40%, 50% of the John McRae program are from students who would from that areas. So I'm wondering, do we assume that there are more high performance athletes in the western part of our board than the rest of the board?
Through you, Chair. Sorry, based on the criteria that is used to define a high performance athlete, I think there are a number of high performance athletes across the city of Ottawa, based on the criteria that is basically being used. I am not aware of numbers in the east, central, or western part of the board, and I couldn't begin to sort of make that assumption if there are more in the west than other areas, Trustee Ellis.
Okay, this causes me to question a lot of the assumptions that are in this report, and I'll cut to the chase. I have a school in my area who would like to advocate for having the high performance athletic program at their facility. So I'm, one of the recommendations, and one that I think I may or make amendment to this, is to consider a second location. You know, it's obvious that for these students, location of the program is what drives them. And as Trustee Penny mentioned, a 2-hour bus to get to JMS will result in what we're seeing there. So how would you envision under this process would staff go about collecting information to see if a second or third location of this program as a congregated program, special program, be sort of undertaken?
Thank you for the question, Trustee Ellis. I think certainly the first thing that we would be doing is going out and identifying the high-level athletes that are
still going.
Sorry
to interrupt you. Go ahead.
Yep. Identifying the high-level athletes, Trustee Ellis, that are not associated with the John McCrae Secondary School program. Identifying how that they are being, how their needs are being met, both their athletic and academic needs are being met, and then our goal would be to identify those skills and characteristics. Then look at ways, whether it would be a congregated program, it would be the use of digital tools, it might be a hybrid model, as opposed to creating another site in somewhere across the district. That may be the case, and it may be a recommendation coming back, but I think our goal would be to, if we're thinking about equity of access and opportunities for all students across the district, I think our primary goal would be how do we do that in each individual community and home school in order to support those students, because I think there's elements of the program that we would be able to do that in, Trustee Ellis, as opposed to identifying additional sites to bring the program into.
So I'm sorry, I can't help but think that basically we're looking to end a congregated high performance athletic program. Certainly what we have to not offer it, to keep it at where it is and offer others something different is not equitable. So not to consider in this process the, if we're going to the students and basically anyone, as Keith mentioned, anyone east of the canal don't have the option that those that live closer to to John McCrae will have. So I'm really troubled by the assumptions made and what we're laying out here in this meeting. I see my time's up. Can you put me back on the list? Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. So we'll go to Sandra next, and then Lyra.
Thanks very much, Chair. And just to follow on what Trustee Ellis and Penny were talking about, again, in the East End, I certainly, Louis Réel, which is a French public school at the secondary level, has a sports program I'm not sure if it is equivalent to the high performance athlete program at John McCrae, but it's certainly, I think, on par with that program. So we certainly lose students to that board in the East End, and I think that that is something that we need to reflect on as we're doing this review. I also just want to remind trustees, and I understand that there's sort of questioning of sort of the intent of the review at this point, but I want to remind trustees that back in 2019, what we agreed upon in reviewing this program was with a site to do away with this program. That is the parameters to which I think the discussion that we had at that time was really looking at how do we ensure that high performance athletes at other school sites have an opportunity to continue to compete in their sport and still achieve high academics. And so I do want to remind trustees that that was kind of the beginnings of this review. But I would concur with colleagues, particularly with Trustee Ellis, that I don't want to see this particular review not consider other sites where we might see access for students who are living out in the East End. So I just wanted to make those comments and concur with my colleagues on that, but also to remind trustees of why this review was taking place to begin with.
That's great. Thanks, Sandra, for the important comments and the additional context. Lyra and then Rob.
So I see a lot of value in this program in the social aspect. We heard from our students who are members of our high performance athletes program that they felt peer interactions, being in groups with their colleagues who understand what they're going through, perhaps their teammates, but all high performance athletes in that congregated setting had value. I concur with the colleagues of mine that have said they would prefer to see a second site in the East End as opposed to simply ending the program. I do want to see this come back to trustees for a final vote. And I don't have any particularly burning questions, but I do want us to keep in mind that we should make decisions to end programs seldom. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks, Lyra. So we'll go to Rob and then student trustee Leo.
Thank you. So I appreciate the discussion. In terms of the question of equitable access or equivalence of access, I mean, surely the golden standard is to meet all students' needs at every school. And so I think that a lesser solution would be if we had multiple sites. We would only go to multiple sites if there was an important business case for congregation. Otherwise, if we can faithfully, broadly serve the needs of students at every school, surely that should be our goal. So I thoroughly support the direction of the staff here. They will be bringing back an interim report and we'll be able to further discuss and see what they've been able to achieve and plan then. But I mean, I think we really have to be clear here. The greatest equity and access will be if we meet the needs of students at every school. A lesser option is to have multiple sites. And I think that there has to be a business case. There has to be a strong business case, which has been questioned with respect to the HPA program in terms of what additional benefit for a not incidental cost is being delivered to these students. If effectively this is more a matter of delivery than curriculum substance or something special. This is especially the delivery flexibility. And maybe we need a central coordinating resource like an arts coordinator to work with admins and others to help these students at every school. So I will support this recommendation. I think it is appropriate, I agree with my colleagues, for the Board of Trustees to approve new programs and to close new programs. So I would expect that naturally to come forward at some point. And we'll see, I guess, in a year or so, what staff have come up with in terms of the report that we get delivered then. But I thought it was really, I think it's really important to suggest that the greatest degree of equity is actually not to congregate anywhere. Okay, if needs are being met. Thank you.
Thanks, Rob. Student trustee Leo and then Christine.
I just wanted to provide like a student opinion just on the report as a whole. Like I think that I would hope that all trustees would be voting like not to like end the program in any way, just considering the, I would say, overall like very positive sort of experience that students have had in the HPA program. And I also especially echo what Trustee Campbell just talked about in terms of like what the best and equity solution is. So my question is, because I think we've been having a sort of greater discussion about like the program and the ways we can change it to make it better. Is that not like included within the first recommendation about diversifying our approach in how we support students in the OCDSB? Just because I think that, so my question is like, are these considerations for just, alternate ways and like alternate methods and some of the things that trustees talked about, are those going to be essentially a topic of like discussion for staff basically under the first recommendation?
It's a very good question. Director or Superintendent Lehman?
Through you, Chair, and thank you for the question. What I can say is yes, unequivocally, that comments and feedback that we've heard here this evening, that we will hear, and then further conversations that we will have, certainly will inform us in our ability to best meet the learning profile of these individual students. And so the information that we gather and that we obtain and that we can bring back and identify the best models to do that will come back to trustees, as Trustee Campbell said in that interim report.
Great, thank you. That's all.
Thank you, Sean. So the next question is from Trustee Boothby.
Thank you. And just a quick comment, listening to all the other comments here. One thing that I'd like to make sure that we explore and see in the report that comes back to us is how we're going to ensure, if we were to recommend closing this program, how are we going to ensure that year over year at each of our high schools, there is this opportunity? And what my worry is, and what I'll trace this back to, is something like our AP program. We have AP classes and quote program at many of our high schools, but it's very dependent on the staff that's there. So I wouldn't want a program like this to end up in that arena where it depends on who the staff is. And from 1 year or 5 years, we have a great robust program, and then significant amounts of the staffing changes over, and they're just not able to, or don't really agree with the significance of this. So that's a significant concern to me when we collapse programs like this, and that to me is a huge equity issue, that we don't allow kids to pick and choose the high schools we go to. We need to make sure when we say we have a system-wide program or a system-wide supports for kids or things that they can engage in, like AP, that it's actually there and it's robust. Because otherwise, if we take a program that seems to have very good support from parents and students and make it what I'll call a hero program, if we have the staff, that is a huge equity issue. So I just want to make sure we address that in the report that comes to us. Thank you.
If I may, Chair, respond to that. Thank you, Trustee Boothby, because you raise a very important point, and it's connected certainly to what Student Trustee Liu had to say as well, and Trustee Campbell's comments. And so certainly a structural approach would have to be brought into play in order to address the question of access to programming at every school. I would want to remind trustees or to ask trustees to consider the notion of an inclusive model as opposed to an outsourcing model. Because as we move forward with a more modernized approach, when we think about how it is that we are engaging all students and that we are looking at their accessing programs, it actually becomes challenging to even to start replicating programs all over the district. We'll still be leaving certain students out. Whereas when we build an inclusive model using a structure of accountability for that model, or accountability of service for that model, it allows for every student who fits the profile and the criteria for that need to be met to have a go-to place. And so Trustee Campbell did table a notion of one structure like that, which would be, rather than having a coordinator in a particular school, having a coordinator for all those students. And so that's a different kind of model that says we're making sure that students are included in their home sites and that every student's needs are included, and we are staffing to support those needs from a structural point of view with an accountability piece. So I do certainly understand, and I have to say it's the first time I've heard the term hero model, but I do understand what you mean, Trustee Boothby, because you are quite right that access to program needs shouldn't be dependent on the goodwill from school to school, because it does represent an inequity.
Thank you.
Great, thanks, Director. Is that it, Christine?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, great. So we're back. I think we're starting our second round speakers, and I see Trustee Ellis, if you want to go, if you want to raise some additional questions.
Yeah, I really don't know how to proceed. I mean, my issue is an equity one, based on geography in this case. If we continue with the program as it is at John McCrae, it sets up an inequitable, but we may not. So I'll leave it at this. I'm going to think on how, and perhaps talk to some other trustees, and perhaps bring a part D to this motion to board. Thank you, Chair.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Chris. And I think it's fair to say that staff have heard us loud and clear in terms of our perspectives and our interests and where we want to see this going. So I'd be shocked if we get to the end of this where we don't have some diversity and some options to consider based on what everyone has said. So I appreciate everyone's feedback. But I do need to call the vote on the recommendation, unless Sandra, do you have another question, or is your hand just still up from your last round?
Yeah, sorry. I did have not another question, but just a clarification. I just wanted to ensure that my comments were not taken as a suggestion that we open a secondary site. It was merely to say that as part of the plan, that there's a consideration of additional sites. And if that's not a recommendation that ultimately comes forward from staff, that's fine. It was more that that's partly contemplated in the thing. I just wanted that clarification.
All right, thanks, Sandra. So with that, then let's call the vote on the recommendation. All those in favor? Okay. Those opposed? Okay. All right.
Abstentions?
We can call abstentions if you like, Chris. Those abstaining? Trustee Ellis. Okay. So that recommendation passes. And with that, we'll move on to item 7.3, report 20-084. But before we do, since it's 8:30, I am going to call a 10-minute break before we start another substantive item. And then Vice Chair Penny is going to take the chair for the remainder of the agenda. So let's recess for 10 minutes, have a bit of a break, and then we'll come back and then we'll pick it up at 7.3, and Trustee Penny will be in the chair. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Hello, everyone. I was, in order to see if we have quorum, when everyone has returned, I'd like to ask trustees to just raise your hand in the participants list, just to see who we have back. Okay, thank you very much. I see that we have quorum again. So let's proceed with the meeting. Thank you very much. And thank you to Trustee Fisher for taking over for me. Really, really appreciate that. An avoidable school council meeting, which went very well, so thank you. And on our agenda, we're on item 7.3, report 20-084, development of a human rights policy. And I'd like to call upon the director to introduce the report. Madam Director.
Thank you, through you, Mr. Chair. Carolyn, our human rights and equity advisor, Carolyn Tanner, is here to present that report. So I'll ask her, I'm not seeing her. Oh, there she's on her screen. So I'll turn it over to our HREA, Carolyn Tanner, at this time to take us through the report with a short presentation.
Thank you, Madam Director, and through you, Chair. I'm just going to start sharing my screen. I just want to make sure that everyone can see it. Okay, so what I'm going to speak to you tonight about is the development of a human rights policy for the Ottawa-Carleton District School Board. I think to start things out, it's probably easier for me to give you a sense of timeline and where we're at. Up until now, I've completed a desk review where I reviewed the Ottawa-Carleton District School Board's policies and procedures, as well as provincial and federal and international frameworks, and then did a pre-consultation. And now we're bringing this forward to propose a consultation plan for the development of a policy with final policy approval anticipated to happen in June next year. So I think it's important to think about why and what we are hoping to get in the development of a policy. The Ottawa-Carleton District School Board is accelerating and intensifying its commitment to centering human rights and equity in all aspects of the board's work. In March 2020, my position started with the board as the Human Rights and Equity Advisor, and the role is to really provide advice to build and maintain a culture of human rights, as well as to develop a mechanism to oversee the investigation and resolution of human rights-based complaints. In October 2020, the district established the Indigenous Equity and Human Rights Division, which recently published the Indigenous Equity and Human Rights Roadmap. And it also established the Arm's Length Office of the Human Rights and Equity Advisor. This will be the office that provides accountability and seeks resolution for the human rights related complaints and concerns. So just as a reminder, when we're talking about a human rights-based approach, it's really centered around three main principles: equality and non-discrimination, participation and inclusion, and transparency and accountability. I think it's important to really think about the context in which human rights arise. And they're centered in their foundation in the International Bill of Human Rights, which is made up of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And this is where the right to education arises. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples recognizes the right of Indigenous peoples to the dignity and diversity of their cultures, traditions, histories, and aspirations, and to have those reflected appropriately in all aspects of education. This right's reflected in the Constitution Act, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, as well as the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada's calls to action, particularly 62, 63, and 64. The right of a child to access education on the basis of equal opportunity that reflects diversity and human rights, that develops the child to their fullest potential, and that is free from discrimination, is guaranteed by the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child and protected by the Ontario Human Rights Code and reflected in the Education Act. The best interest of the child must be the primary consideration in guiding actions that impact on that child. The fundamental right to equality and to be free from discrimination is enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and reflected in the Charter and the Ontario Human Rights Code, and it's further reflected in the Occupational Health and Safety Act. And the rights of persons with disabilities to equally access opportunities is set out in the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and also protected by the Ontario Human Rights Code and the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act and the Education Act. The right of a person to be free from racial discrimination is also set out in the United Nations Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination and the United Nations Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination against Women, also protected in the Code and the Anti-Racism Act. And it's sort of within this framework of rights and responsibilities that the Ottawa-Carleton District School Board seeks to develop a policy and related procedures that will sort of set standards of behavior, clarify roles and responsibilities, and establish a mechanism for accountability. So as a service provider and as an employer, the Ottawa-Carleton District School Board has a legal duty to support and protect human rights for students and employees and people who access and use the premises. The board has a number of policies and procedures that support human rights, and in particular, policies and procedures related to anti-discrimination, accommodation, and setting up complaints processes to process complaints. However, there are a number of policy gaps, and this is what the policy would seek to address. There are gaps around protection and promotion of human rights, gaps around fully addressing anti-discrimination so that there's a complaints mechanism as well for students and community members, gaps around a full set of policies and procedures that address all forms of accommodation. Currently, the policies only set out processes for accommodation on some grounds and some categories of rights holders, but not others. And we're also having gaps around accountability. We lack a formal human rights complaint mechanism to address individual and systemic human rights-based concerns from students, family, employees, and community members. So why do we need a human rights policy? I really see it as an opportunity for the board to consolidate itself as a leader in the education system by committing to promoting and protecting human rights, centering human rights and equity in decision-making, and creating transparent accountability mechanisms. Formalizing a human rights policy as well as a complaints procedure for human rights related concerns is a requirement under the Ontario Human Rights Code and facilitates early resolution. It reduces risk, and it helps reduce the number of unresolved cases advancing to the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal. Most of all, it helps our students and our employees to fully access their rights and removes barriers such as discrimination. In developing the policy, I think we should be giving consideration to enshrining the legal requirements set out in the domestic and international human rights framework that I've already spoken about. And I expect that the policy will address our human rights obligations as a service provider and our human rights obligation as an employer. And it will really be benefiting students, family, community members, and employees. It will cover human rights concepts and principles, anti-discrimination, accommodation, and accountability, and a complaints mechanism. There are some key principles that we should be thinking about and enshrining when we develop a human rights policy. First, human rights law in Canada, in particular, the Ontario Human Rights Code is quasi-constitutional, which means it has primacy over other provincial legislation, just as the Charter has primacy over other legislation in Canada. So that should be enshrined within the human rights policy for the board, that the human rights policy will have primacy over other policies and procedures, and they must be compliant with the human rights policy. It should enshrine ideas like dignity and respect, equal rights and equal opportunity, full participation, rights and responsibilities, anti-oppression, anti-colonialism, anti-racism, anti-discrimination, the duty to accommodate, undue hardship, look at issues of intersectionality and competing rights, think about concepts like targeted universalism, discuss impact versus intent, be proactive on prevention, and to really be responsive and corrective and remedial rather than punitive. The objective of the consultation is really to engage students, employees, families, and communities to seek meaningful input and build support around the development of a policy and adherence to a policy once one's in place. I'm proposing a phased consultation process. Already, up until now, we're sitting here in December. I have held pre-consultation meetings with an internal working group that I put together of subject matter experts from within the board. I've had pre-consultation meetings with the Indigenous Education team, the Ministry of Education's Equity Secretariat, and the Human Rights and Equity Advisor Network from around Ontario. I've had a pre-consultation meeting with the members of ACE and have one coming up this week with IAC and CIAC. And I've also met with student trustees. Feedback that I've received so far has been incorporated into the draft consultation plan. And I'm proposing that the consultation plan will take place in 2 phases. During phase 1, we'll really focus on 5 main things: meeting with students, staff, parents, and community to identify gaps and challenges with existing policies and procedures, to identify any special considerations from an Indigenous, racialized, or minoritized perspective, including 2S LGBTQ+ and people with a disability, to consider whether or not we should be expanding the protected grounds that are listed under the Ontario Human Rights Code to also include grounds such as socio and economic status, class, and other considerations that may be relevant or pertinent. I will be looking for recommendations on how to create a complaints procedure that will be accessible to all users. And I'll be trying to identify steps needed and tools required to ensure effective uptake of the policy after it's passed. The target groups for the consultation and the users of the policy are intended to be students, employees, parents and caregivers, and community partners, groups, and members of the public. In particular, I'm going to, through this consultation process, we want to make it bottom up. And really, we want to build the policy from the bottom to the top. So during phase 1, we'll seek to consult with students, such as student networks like Original Voices, the Black Youth Forum, the Rainbow Youth Forum, students who have complex disabilities, English language learners, student trustees, and the Student Senate. Parents and caregivers, such as, and in particular, seek out the voices of parents of Indigenous, racialized, or minoritized students, newcomers, parents of children with disabilities, members of PIC, and other parents who care to participate, employees, including principals and vice principals, guidance staff, staff affiliate groups, including the Black Educators Network, the Muslim Educators Network, the Learning Disability Network, and the Rainbow Educators Network, and with community groups such as the Aboriginal Coalition of Ottawa, the Inuit Elder Circle, Uniting for Children and Youth, 613-819 Black Hub, a CELU Collective, organizations serving children's mental health needs, and other groups recommended by the committees or councils. We'll also be planning meetings with the advisory councils, and in particular, ACE, IAC, PIC, and CIAC, as well as federations and unions. Recognizing that we're trying to engage in a bottom-up consultation process during the pandemic, it does present some unique challenges, but most of the consultations will be done virtually, either through virtual focus group discussions, public meetings where representatives of community organizations can send a representative, and one-on-one meetings where it's needed in order to get individual perspectives when required. We'll also be attending committee and council meetings, inviting written submissions on our website, using thought exchange and survey in the website, and any other methods that might be identified through consultation. Because we want to hear the voices of people who are not always heard and the voices of people who may be accessing the policy and procedures in the future, we will be making a strong effort to have translation and interpretation available where needed to ensure that those who need to participate can. And I just have a couple of more slides to wind up the discussion. The preliminary consultation questions in phase 1 will really focus on what is needed to make a complaints procedure accessible, what the gaps are, whether or not we should consider using our policy to expand protected grounds of discrimination, looking at the tools needed to ensure effective uptake, and looking at any special considerations of particular identity groups. The reason we want to do this in phases is that we will take this information to then draft the policy. The policy will be drafted, and then we will take the draft policy back to the same groups that we consulted with during phase 1 in phase 2 and seek their input on the draft policy. During this time, we'll also be collecting information so that we can make informed decisions about how to develop relevant procedures like the complaints mechanism, so it can really be accessible to those people who are using it, and it can be culturally relevant. So you may ask how the board can support. I'm interested in getting feedback on how we can make the consultation process more inclusive, thoughts on whose voices are missing, any recommendations on who we should meet with, and any other policy elements or considerations to consider in developing the consultation process. And this is just a reminder of the path forward. We're just winding up the pre-consultation phase, and if the consultation plan is approved, we expect the consultations during phase 1 to be wrapped up by February 2021. The draft policy will happen in March 2021. By the end of May 2021, phase 2 of the consultation process will be complete, and we're anticipating bringing a draft policy back to board for discussion and approval sometime in June 2021. And I think that wraps it up for me, so I'm pleased to take any questions that may arise from my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that presentation, very informative. And we do have a couple of trustees, and we'll start with Trustee Ellis.
Thank you. I'm wondering why OCASC, Ottawa-Carleton Assembly of School Councils, are not one of the consulting bodies we'll be doing on this.
So it's not, they could be included. I feel like there will be opportunities for parents to engage, and there will be many. We're trying to create a number of different mechanisms for parents to engage if they are interested, through surveys, through engagement, but we could also include them as a group to engage with as well. I was trying to really bring into the process voices that are often unheard. And that's why the focus was on other groups initially.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and it is very important to do it, but OCASC has been, as well as our school councils. You know, they're not there. These are important institutions. I would, and I'll be moving a motion to include school councils and OCASC in this. In fact, I have a number of amendments I'd like to make to the consultation plan, Chair. Shall I go ahead now?
You have the floor, Trustee Ellis. So if you
and the timer's not going. I'm making up for the one that went. Yeah. So
if you wish to move the motion,
I move the motion that school councils and OCASC be included in consultation. I think these are important partners, and it would be good even that they're aware of this is going on. But they're would be back. So that's my wrap up for that. I have others. I think I'll go through them a bit one at a time.
Okay, thank you
So
very
for those
much.
two.
So the motion as amended by Trustee Ellis has been moved onto the floor, and we're moving on
Mr. Chair,
to. Yes.
Did Trustee Ellis actually move the?
No, I didn't. I'll move the
report?
motion. I'll move the motion, and then I'll make the my amendments. So I'd like to move the recommendation for the consultation plan, Chair.
All right, thank you very much, Trustee Ellis. And then moving on to Trustee Bell.
Well, no, I'm not ceding the floor. Now I want to make amendments to it. So I made amendments. Okay. I moved it with the amendment that OCASC and school councils be included. I have another amendment, Chair.
Okay, go ahead.
In the on page 63. No, where am I? Okay, on page 60, the April 2021, it says presenting draft policy to DEC, April 6th. I'd like to put another bullet in that section, and it will be present draft policy to COW, April 13 for discussion. And I put that there. I think it would be helpful and could be used in the further consultations with the committees that we have there, which will of course include school councils and OCASC, to hear what trustees think about it. And it will also be beneficial for trustees to have an opportunity to discuss amongst themselves where it is before the final version. I think that would be very beneficial for everyone.
Trustee Ellis, if you could just elaborate a little bit further on where that change was, so that's just for clarity's sake. Thank you.
Yeah, on page 60, phase 2, there's on the table, there's the row March 2021. And then below that is April 2021. Next to that is a bullet which states presenting the draft policy to DEC. And then April 6th is in brackets. I'm suggesting that another bullet be put into that same cell, which says presenting draft policy to Committee of the Whole, April 13 for discussion.
Okay. Just trying to find exactly where that is, Trustee Ellis, as far as in the report or in the agenda. Is it in the appendix?
It's in the consultation timeline.
Okay.
If I may,
And from the folio, from the PDF, it's page 60 of 63.
It's the appendix, Trustee Penny.
Oh, is that an appendix?
Yeah. And there's
Okay.
a chart.
And that is phase 2. Okay, I see it now. Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, I wasn't clear.
And it says present policy to COW June 8th, and instead you want present policy to COW April the
13th.
April the 13th.
I'm looking. I've checked the board calendar, and we have a COW on that day. So unless it changes, then of course we'll adjust it. But the essence is that that it's discussed at COW.
Okay. So Trustee Ellis has moved the amendment to the plan, and do we have a staff comment on that?
Through you, Chair, that's a great idea. I think it would be very good to get trustee input before the final draft goes to COW, so happy to do that.
Okay, thank you very much. And is there any discussion on the amendment? Trustee Bell, do you have a comment on the amendment?
No, I do not.
Okay, Trustee Scott, do you have a comment on the amendment?
Is it friendly?
Okay, please indicate with your hand up if you feel the amendment is not friendly. And it appears the amendment is friendly.
That's great.
Yes.
And that ends my interventions, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Trustee Scott?
I think Trustee Bell actually was ahead of me on the
Yes.
list.
Yes, so actually I had a list created, and it was originally Trustee Campbell was right after Trustee Ellis. So go ahead, Trustee Campbell.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much to our advisor, Ms. Tanner. The consultation plan is great. I really appreciate it. I appreciate some of the offline help I've received in terms of working through it in my own mind. Just a couple of things, though, I guess, just to put it out there for, I guess, the public record or discussion. And I'm not sure whether this will lead to a consultation plan amendment or not, but it states up front, or maybe in the covering letter, that the projected policy would be a centerpiece. I think I may be paraphrasing, but it's along those lines, for both human rights and equity. So I'm assuming, in a sense, our equity efforts, all types, with respect certainly to identity, but also with respect to status, such as mental health status, an impoverished status, etc., which I don't know that any human rights code assures people that they won't live below the medium income level. So the I guess what I'd like reassurance of perhaps is that questions of poverty and any other barrier, and you had mentioned in your oral that what might be our OCDSB grounds for protection and redress might be expanded beyond those absolutely required in charters and declarations. And so I guess I'm sort of wondering, since in a sense, this plan will inform, I guess, what those consultants see and how they engage. Will we be engaging them with respect to other barriers which may not be clearly called out in the declarations and charters that would found the policy? Hopefully that's a clear enough question. I can try again more concisely if not.
Through you, Mr. Chair. So the short answer to that is that the Ontario Human Rights Code sets out grounds where people are protected from discrimination. Those grounds do not currently include socioeconomic status or class. Under disability, which is a protected ground, it does include people with mental health challenges and people who that's considered to be a disability. So I believe that is already protected. If we're looking at protected grounds of discrimination through the international framework, the International Bill of Rights, so in particular, the International Convention on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, expands the grounds of discrimination that are protected from discrimination more expansively. So it includes things like nationality and social status. And it includes things like language. And it also has the term "and other grounds." So it's not considered to be an exhaustive definition. So I would say it's within the purview of the board to consider whether it wants to make a policy decision to expand grounds that we are protecting from discrimination with our human rights policy. And certainly one way to go about looking at that would be to ask that in the consultation during phase 1. So we can specifically brief people that we are consulting with on what the international framework looks like, what is protected there, and what we might want to consider expanding it to within the board here. And I know that socioeconomic status is something that centers quite heavily in the strategic planning of this board, so it might be something to consider.
Okay, great. I just wanted to be reassured that because it wasn't front and center, and a lot of the, at least I guess Ontario doesn't really call that out or protect that, that would be advanced as a consultation question one way or the other. So that's greatly reassuring. And I take it, obviously, by the same token that bringing in poverty-related advocacy groups such as ACORN and others would be something that would be considered in terms of consultation. I mean, the community groups lists such as, so again, that's a non-exclusive list. So that is very helpful. And that's all I'll speak to publicly at this time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Trustee Campbell. And I might remind trustees that we do have one other large item coming up. So I would be remiss not to remind trustees to try to keep their comments brief as possible, but still try to have a fulsome discussion on this. So anyway, we'll move on. And I think Trustee Bell, you did have your hand up.
Great. Thank you very much, Ms. Tanner, for presenting this and all the work that's gone into it. The questions that you had at the end of your presentation, I think, are incredibly pertinent and important. And I especially wanted to raise the issue of consultation fatigue, which is real, especially right now with the rising consciousness around racism. I think ACORN, all of the organizations have been consulted numerous times by various levels of the government on a number of related issues. And so I think the question of how we can do this is important. And so I would look to, I know we have to keep it tight, but I would look to my colleagues and to others around the table for throwaway word, but innovative ways for us to engage these populations, particularly those that don't typically get consulted, have been consulted recently. And so I guess my question for the board is there a way that we can offer incentive to participants to engage in this consultation? And what would those incentives look like?
Was that a question for me, Trustee Bell? If I may, through you, Mr. Chair, so I think consultation fatigue, it is real, there is no doubt. I've had this discussion with other people in my role in different boards and other boards that are similarly moving along the path. And while it is real, there's also very much a need to make sure that what we are developing suits the needs of the people that it serves and that it's accessible to the people it's intended to serve. So it is important for us to get those perspectives. The question becomes, how do we do it? And feedback that I heard from a visitor to ACE last week when I was there was that when we are engaging with Indigenous community groups, it will be important for me to go there and meet those organizations one-on-one. No longer should we be asking them to come to us. Other feedback that I got was students may not want to engage, but that our Indigenous education team has sufficient expertise to drive me in the right direction and to drive the policy in the right direction. So we'll be relying on internal expertise as well as one-on-one engagement. And I guess the incentive that I see is the process that we're using is really one of building a policy. So I hope that the incentive for people to continue to participate will be when they actually see that what they are saying is being reflected in the draft policy that's brought back to them, and that we are actually building a policy that will serve them. We're not going out with something that's drafted from the beginning to the end and saying, hey, what do you think? We're truly going in with just a skeleton and saying, how can we shape this? What changes do we need? What's important to you? I'm also hoping that by using different methods of engagement and offering different methods of engagement and going through trusted networks that already exist, we'll be able to reach some of the people we don't typically reach, and that people who we do typically reach will see the importance of engaging and the influence that their voice can have. I think that's the best answer I can give you on that. Does that help answer your question?
It does help answer the question. Thank you. Can we pay people? Can we offer them something for engaging?
That's an interesting, I would be worried about the precedent that would set, through you, Mr. Chair, sorry. I would be worried about the precedent that would set for engagement in the future. And I also don't currently have a budget for this other than what currently exists. There's no particular budget line for this consultation. So that's something I would have to take under advisement and check within the district. But my gut instinct on that is that it's tricky when we start paying people to consult because it sets a precedent that makes consultation in the future more difficult.
If I may, through you, Chair, a part of the challenge too with incentive around consultation is we want to ensure that consultation is done not only freely of spirit, if you will, but also reflective of a wholesome approach. And there will beg a question, I believe, around ethics once we start to remunerate people for providing an opinion. So I think that there are a number of challenges that are fraught with going down that road. And the invitation for consultation is just that. It's not a requirement, but there are multiple ways of doing it that doesn't necessarily draw on the same people all the time. But it is certainly something that we're trying to ensure that we're providing a structure for service and improving the way that we serve our community. And so one of the things we know is that the voices of the community are important in that construction. So it's an invitation to collaborate. And we do believe that there is an appetite for that collaboration and engagement. And that while it is, we certainly can speak to lots of different kinds of fatigue right now, given COVID and so many of the pieces that we've gone through, that despite fatigue, there is the overwhelming appetite to contribute and collaborate usually pushes us through. So I wanted to just add that piece to it because I think the notion of there's incentives and then there is payment, and I think the challenge of payment is hugely problematic in an endeavor like this one.
That's all for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Trustee Bell, and we're moving on to Trustee Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm wearing my very large rural hat here. It's important to understand that diversity is, or at least visible diversity, is not evenly distributed across the city of Ottawa, across the OCDSB. One group that historically has not always had very good access to consultation and that has not necessarily had a lot of direct exposure to visible diversity is in our rural schools, our rural communities. It's really important, if this is going to work, that the consultation is not just a consultation opportunity, but also a learning opportunity for all those who participate. So I guess my question is, will there be any particular efforts to engage some of those people from the friendly, where we have schools where there may be only one student in a fairly large school who is visibly different, where there may be a lot of hidden diversity, where we don't necessarily talk about it very much or understand it very well, but where there is a huge need to make sure that it does, that the whole concept of human rights and diversity is a well understood and supported concept as something that is really important to all of our students and to all of our staff.
Thank you for the question, Trustee Scott, through you, Mr. Chair. So you raise, I think, a critical point, which is this policy will only work if people know about it, know what it's meant to do, and know how to use it to, first of all, protect their rights, but also to understand what their obligations are to respect and protect others. So part of what I'm trying to do with phase 1 of the consultation questions is to identify what pieces we need to put in place in terms of outreach and awareness raising for after the policy is passed, to help people understand what the content of the policy is, how to access it, and where to go. And I really see this consultation process as one of the side benefits of it is that it should raise awareness and should raise understanding about human rights and how they impact on everyone. So yes, you raise a very good point, Trustee Scott, and I will make efforts to get to our more rural schools that don't necessarily have high populations of visibly identifiably diverse students, where there may be hidden diversity, and engage with them and speak, because I agree with you, it's a really important opportunity. And if we can engage them from the process, it starts really promoting that culture of centering human rights and diversity as we move forward. Thank you for the suggestion.
Thank you very much for that response. And I have one further request, and that is, would it be possible, please, to share the PowerPoint presentation that you showed us in this meeting? That was a very useful summary, I think.
With pleasure.
And that's it for me.
Thank you very much, Trustee Scott. And moving on to Trustee Liu.
I just wanted to partly address what Trustee Bell brought up. So if Advisor Tanner, if you do come across the outcome where the networks that you've listed are what's the word? Consultation fatigued, then the previous suggestion that Charles and I have made also for Superintendent Farish previously for her consultation plan as well, was that you can consult school clubs. So, Rainbow Youth Clubs, at my school, we have a Black Excellence Club. So that is always an option that is open. And if incentives are a problem, then I don't know if this is possible, but a non-monetary incentive would be community involvement hours. Again, on a granular level, not sure how feasible that is, but those are some options. The other thing I wanted to mention is I hope that that when you're that in the consultation process, when you're going to specific groups, that intersectionality is going to be a good part of that conversation, because what Trustee Scott mentioned is what sort of just brought this idea to my mind, which is that, for example, the experience of a student of color in a school with a lot of students of color is going to differ from like a student of color in a school where there aren't as many, right? So I think taking into consideration these diverse experiences even within a group and also the intersections of those experiences would be an important thing. So I just wanted to jump in with those ideas.
Thank you very much, student trustee Liu. And moving on to trustee Lyra.
I have asked this question in our consultation pre-processes before. How many people do you feel you're going to need to consult with before you consider the consultation to have been a success?
Through you, Mr. Chair, that's an interesting question. For me, the fundamentals of human rights don't need consultation. Like, we know what the human rights are and we know where those stand. What we really need to hear from a range of people on is how we can make it accessible to them, and how and what they need in order to be able to feel comfortable advancing and safe advancing their concerns when they are raised. So I don't think this is a consultation that requires thousands and thousands of people, but I do think it requires a very diverse cross-section of people that represent employees, that represent students, that represent family, and that represent community. And I think it's the important rich information that's going to come from that is through qualitative engagement and discussion, rather than necessarily from surveys. So I don't have a particular number in mind, but I do have an interest in making sure that everyone who wants to have a say can have a say. And that's why we will be doing in-person consultations, but we will also be providing opportunities through surveys and feedback so people can engage. And I think that using this variety of mechanisms, we should get a good balance between quantitative and qualitative feedback and be able to develop a policy that works.
The reason I bring this up is in the past, the district has had consultations with fewer than 5 attendees. And I think that kind of reach or feedback is not as useful as it needs to be for something this important. You've listed a number of groups, of various minoritized groups. I think setting a goal of at least 24 people from each of those groups would be a reasonable threshold. And if you don't reach it, you have to go back and say, we didn't get to a couple of dozen from this group. We'll need to do additional outreach here. I'm curious to know what your thoughts are.
Through you, Mr. Chair, on its face, that sounds reasonable. When I have reached out to some networks, for example, when I've reached out to discuss how to engage effectively with our 2S LGBTQ+ community, I'm told they're struggling and that this is a very difficult time and that it will be very difficult to get a high level of participation because they're struggling and the pandemic is creating a difficult situation. So when I discussed engaging with Indigenous students, I had a similar response and feedback. So while I admire and would try to reach as many people as we could, I just want to as well be sensitive to existing conditions and give thought to how we might be able to get some of that input from other areas if we can't get it directly from the people that we're hoping to speak to.
If our goal is to figure out what works for an individual population, I think it's very important that we hear directly from that population. I don't want to make a motion to require you to meet with 24 people from every group, but I'm going to strongly encourage you to set an internal threshold, a number, and then try and meet that number. I also want to echo what Trustee Bell said about considering remuneration for members of those groups if you aren't able to get to that minimum threshold. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Trustee Lara. And we're moving on to Seema Lamba. Please go ahead.
Yes. For those that don't know me, I'm the ACE representative on COW. And I just wanted to acknowledge that Carolyn did come to ACE, and I see some of the feedback we have given is incorporated into that. So thank you. I did have just one question. It kind of was around like not being necessarily a visible person that might fall within the human rights grounds. In your public meetings and surveys and interviews, will you be asking people to fill out a self-ID form? It can be anonymous. It can be like, you know, when they come or whatever, just so you have the demographics of that community as well. Will you be doing that?
You're muted, Ms. Tanner.
Through you, Mr. Chair. Thank you. Novice mistake. Thank you for that suggestion on surveys. Absolutely. I think it's really important to be able to understand and interpret data through identity. And it's a good question in terms of the public meetings. The way I'd envisioned it in my mind would be that we would have a public meeting for a particular network or a group of organizations, and that would help us give us, people who identified that way could come to the meeting, and that would help us give us insight without necessarily collecting. But that does miss out on the intersectionality piece. So I think we could certainly give consideration to collecting voluntary identity data if people are willing to provide it. I think it's a great idea.
All right, thank you very much. And seeing no further speakers to this, I'm going to return to the original mover, which is Trustee Ellis, for our wrap up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't think there's any necessary. We had good conversation, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Trustee Ellis. And I'd like to call the question on the recommendations for the consultation plan. All those in favor? And opposed? And abstentions? And the motion passes. Thank you very much. So moving on in our agenda to item 8, report from statutory and other committees. And this is 8.1, the COW meeting of November 4th, 2020. I'd like to call for a mover to confirm the special
Mr.
education.
Chair?
Sorry, yep.
When we amended the agenda at the beginning of the meeting, we moved matters for discussion. We moved the the equitable recruitment and hiring policy to item 8.
Oh, okay. My apologies. So therefore, we're going to move on to matters for discussion report 20-114, equitable recruitment and hiring policy. And I'd like to call upon the director to introduce the report.
Thank you, and through you, Chair, I will turn the report over to Superintendent McCoy, who will share with us the report and respond to questions as appropriate. Superintendent McCoy, please.
Thank you, and through you, Chair, we are presenting for discussion this evening as opposed to action, a draft equitable recruitment and hiring policy. I'll make just a few introductory comments and then open it up for questions, as I know we're getting late in the evening. The policy has been developed in response to and as part of the requirements that are currently set out in what is a draft PPM that was issued by the government following the repeal of Regulation 274, which set out some fairly specific requirements with regard to hiring practices for occasional teachers, long-term occasional teachers, and our permanent contract teachers. So with the repeal of that regulation, the government issued the draft PPM and had a short period where they were collecting feedback. It was anticipated that the PPM would be finalized and released by now, and so we have been operating within the time frame set out in the PPM, which required school boards to have hiring policies in place by the end of December, which aligned with the requirements set out in the PPM. I also wanted to note, however, that the creation of an equitable recruitment and hiring policy is work that is included in the Indigenous Human Rights and Equity Roadmap that was shared with trustees earlier this fall, and is work that was going to be undertaken during this school year. So the PPM did change our plans somewhat in that it moved up the timeline under which we were operating, and also based on the PPM, at this point, we're bringing forward a policy which applies only to hiring with regard to our teaching positions, but which moving forward, we will be looking at potentially expanding to apply to all of the hiring within the board to ensure that regardless of the position being applied to, that candidates will have a similar experience. Also wanted to note that although the timelines were short, we have started and will be continuing consultation with representatives from our federation partners, specifically those who represent our occasional teachers and teachers, as well as representatives of our principals and vice principals. We're also received assistance from a working group that was established of senior human resource officials in the province who developed a working document to provide advice to school boards as they were doing the work on their policies. With the potential extension of the timeframe for putting the policy in place, it's also our hope that we can expand our consultation to include other groups, including representatives from the affinity groups that were identified earlier by our Human Rights and Equity Advisor that currently exist in the district, so that we are ensuring that we are getting or providing an opportunity for input from a broader range of stakeholders. So again, depending on the timing of the PPM, it's our intention to either hopefully have the policy approved next week at board, or perhaps with some additional time, bringing it back in January for approval, or within the time frame that is set out in the policy. In the meantime, we are also, as staff, working on procedures which will provide more specific guidance with regard to the hiring practices that will be put in place to align with the fundamental principles in the PPM and in the policy, including ensuring that the processes are fair, transparent, equitable, and that include measures and processes for monitoring our progress, and including the collection of data as we move forward to help inform our decision-making as we move forward. So with that, Chair, I'm happy to take questions on the policy that we've provided.
This item, and we're going to start off with Trustee Campbell.
Whoops, there we go. Thank you very much. I won't take much time. I provided some advance suggestions and thoughts, and I look forward to seeing perhaps some of those reflected in the final version that comes to board, but I guess we'll see. But for the record, I guess I'll call out that I'm thinking that we may need or could use the addition of a clause directing monitoring regime, or the establishment of a monitoring regime with respect to representativity gap closures, as I believe is called out in the PPM, or suggested in the PPM. That's one possible clause addition I'm thinking about. And then possibly being explicit in terms of conferring to staff the authority to invoke the special programs clause in the noted in the PPM. So I think, again, that might be something that could usefully and probably should be clearly in the policy. So I'll just put those out there for a thought. And I have only one question, and that is, could I be reminded, and I'm sure I've been told, but I forget, where we are with respect to a teaching staff diversity census?
So through you, Chair, we're currently in the process of planning that right now. We've just completed some focus group sessions where we invited staff to engage in some conversations with us, facilitated by a third party. And our plan is to launch a survey. We were hoping by the end of February, but we've just been in discussions with the third party who will be helping us, and it'll likely be early March, so before the March break, and it will be an equity and engagement survey. So it will collect identity-based data from staff, as well as additional information with regard to the relationship between identity and engagement and other factors impacting on engagement.
That's great. That's very much appreciated. That would be all staff, which obviously would go beyond the scope of this particular teacher hiring policy. But I can see this be very useful, and is certainly acting as a baseline. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Trustee Campbell. And moving on to Trustee Bell.
Thank you very much. Looking at the qualifications and merit through you, Chair, I'm seeing additional valuing applicants, additional lived experiences. What are the plans to help populate the examples of what those would be? Because I'm just thinking along the lines of, it's going to be transparent and equitable, ensuring that we have that clearly laid out, what sort of additional lived experience would be taken into account, would be very helpful.
Thank you for the question, Trustee Bell. And we are, as we develop this policy and the procedures, working with our equity team, including the Human Rights and Equity Advisor and our superintendent responsible for equity. And that's part of the ongoing discussion that we are having, is in terms of ensuring that we are reflecting the principles underlying the policy through the specifics, and that will include being clear about what those lived experiences are. And so, you know, some of the input that's been provided so far through our discussions at DEC, and which we have started to embed in our hiring practices, would be lived experiences in terms of supporting supporting different communities, and how some of those experiences might be outside of the traditional qualifications that we have looked for, but working with and supporting different communities, for example, living among different communities would be some of the examples that so far we have included as part of our thinking, but again, that continues to be informed by our discussions with our equity team.
Thank you. And through you, Chair, a follow-up question would be, can we consult ACE on those lived experiences? But further, given the focus of this policy on equity, I would hope that ACE would have an opportunity to provide comments on it.
So through you, Chair, part of our challenge has been the limited timelines that we've had from the release of the PPM to getting a policy in place. We did ask about sort of the scheduling of ACE in relation to the creation of this policy. And so now that it looks like we may have an opportunity for an extension, that's certainly something that we will be doing. And whether we do it prior to the approval of this specific policy, it will be something that we foresee doing as we move forward, and perhaps as part of the expansion of this policy to other employee groups, if not before this particular policy is approved. And again, that will depend on the timing of the next meeting relative to when we need to have this approved.
Thank you very much. I would really heavily support this policy being consulted at ACE before it moves forward, if possible. Thank you.
And thank you very much, Trustee Bell. And moving on to Mr. Lesage.
Thank you, Chair. Through you, good evening, everyone. Brian Lesage on behalf of elementary teachers. We certainly did welcome the opportunity to give our input to HR and LR staff, labor relations staff, and we look forward to continuing those discussions as this policy is developed and as it ultimately perhaps leads to a procedure. We would say first off that we would identify revoking Reg 274 as an extremely regrettable decision. It is not a decision that was made by this board. It was made by the ministry, but it is regrettable nonetheless. There was no evidence whatsoever that suggested the reg prevented boards from hiring a diversity of teachers to reflect their student populations. EDFO is an organization that is committed to equity and diversity and social justice. It's steeped into everything that we do. And we would identify that, and we would suggest that boards had the ability to hire OTs and add them to their lists to reflect diversity goals that they may have had. The reg was not a barrier to that. What we fear is that revoking the reg is going to lead to an increase in the problem of a shortage of OTs, because the ministry has removed the clear path to employment for occasional teachers. So there's a difference between hiring and then staffing. And from a contract teacher perspective, as contract teachers, we would certainly suggest that a board policy that leads to a procedure is not something that can govern staffing and transfer and vacancy processes. These would have to obviously be collectively bargained and be part of a collective agreement. We have concerns about wording in the draft policy that speaks to a broader definition of experience. The fear we have there is that if this leads to very wide subjective criteria for hiring, this could prioritize skills or duties that don't directly fall within a teacher's core responsibilities. And this is problematic.
Mr. Lesage, you've gone a little bit over your time, so either wrap it up or you can go back on the list if you wish.
I would finish by saying the mobility provisions of this. I think our board is not well placed to compete in terms of attracting candidates from outside of our board, because our language around experience credit is compared to other locals not strong. And we would take issue with contract teachers or teachers from outside of Ottawa being given priority ahead of teachers who are already working for our district. So we look forward to continuing the conversation with HR and labor relations as the board works towards a policy and a procedure. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lesage. And moving on to Ms. Lamba.
Okay, so I have a few questions. And this is just from my understanding. So when I looked at the qualifications and merits, it says in addition to adhering to the qualification merits in Regulation 298, and then they list some. So I actually come from an employment equity background, and some of my concerns, so my question is, will these additional criterias, and I understand the concern that we just heard from the previous speaker, will these become sort of, will they outweigh some of the other criteria? I'm gonna put it in the context of employment equity. For example, if you have an employment equity gap, which means you have underrepresentation, let's say in a school or in a particular area, then you designate that position for that, whatever the gap is for. So if it happens to be you have a gap for an Indigenous teacher, then you will say, I will hire an Indigenous teacher. I will not look at any other applicants unless there is no other Indigenous staff or a candidate that is that qualifies. So I'm just trying to figure out how this will work. And then I'll ask more questions.
So through you, Chair, and thank you for the question. The policy and the accompanying procedure would not, I would say, go so far as to what the you were suggesting in terms of the representation piece. I think there is certainly an intention, and both in terms of the commitment and in its application to ensuring that the criteria, the selection criteria that is considered is broad and goes beyond the technical qualifications that are set out in 298, and which would not, in all cases, allow for other considerations beyond those technical qualifications to go into the hiring decision. So it's intended to certainly broaden what can be considered with a view to trying to ensure, therefore, that we're addressing any of the potential barriers that might exist now to promoting diversification of our workforce, but not necessarily in the way that you are suggesting, at least not at this stage. It's not to say that at some point in the future the work might not take us there, but I don't think that's what this is necessarily intended to do.
Okay, thank you. So I just want to be clear, it is not about hiring unqualified people. People meet the qualifications, they have merit. You're hiring them because you have a gap and you need to fix it. And in fact, that is kind of consistent with what the board has put out in some of their data collection and the language that they're using around employment systems reviews, and special programs, although we don't call it special programs in the federal, but so it is very consistent with that. And so I would like to see that as part of the process, because that is the reason why employment equity was created. It's not because non-equity groups were less qualified than other. They were equally qualified, but because of unconscious bias and whatever other things factored into it, they weren't being hired. So it's really important to think about that. I know I don't have a lot of time, so I'll move on to my other question is, so it was brought up that the monitoring and evaluation piece isn't in the policy. So are you saying that's not part of the policy, that's actually going to be part of the procedure? And isn't it kind of required to be in the policy? I was confused by that.
So through you, Chair, I think Trustee Campbell in his comments, and he had sent this to me earlier, had identified that in his view there's a gap, and so that's something that we've committed to going back and looking for. There certainly are elements of that in the PPM, and so my thinking is right now that will be part of what comes back in the policy before it's approved is a specific reference to the measuring and monitoring piece.
Okay, will it look like what's currently in the ministries? Will it be duplicated like that into the policy?
It will certainly align with it and be consistent with it. Whether it will incorporate all of those elements, we'll just have to ensure that it's also consistent with our general policy language, but I think there will be a close alignment between it, yes.
Okay. And I just wanted one clarification. It was the one that Trustee Bell had brought up, and it's interesting how I interpreted it a little bit differently, because it was different from the ministry's document, from your document, where it said unqualified underrepresented groups and staff with lived with experience, lived experience or something like that. So we are just talking about underrepresented groups and staff, right? We're not talking about people who may not be coming from underrepresented groups, but who have experiences in the Indigenous communities or with other groups. We're specifically focusing that. Okay, I just wanted to be clear on that.
So through you, Chair, I think it would apply to both. I think it would be valuing those experiences in addition to the qualifications. And so I think we do want to ensure that that kind of experience is valued as part of the hiring process. But if I understand the questioner correctly, I think there is some additional value in terms of the lived experiences of someone who is also part of the community in terms of how that would be valued.
Okay, so that would be contrary to employment equity. So when we're talking about equity measures and special measures, it's targeted towards the underrepresented group. I think you can add an additional criteria for non-equity groups to have an equity lens or a lived experience like that, but you cannot be, putting somebody who's underrepresented at the same, hiring level when we're talking about employment equity, who's non-equity but has experience. I mean, that's great, but those are two very separate things. If I misunderstood, I'm sorry, but that's what I heard. So.
Through you, Chair, no, I don't think you misunderstood, but we will go back then to the language because I appreciate the comments in terms of looking at those two things differently. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Lamba. Your time is up, but your comments are very, very well noted. Thank you very much. And did you want to go back on the list at the end?
I'm okay. If something comes up, I'll put my hand up again.
Okay, no problem. Thank you very much. And we're moving on to Pat Dixon.
Thank you, Chair. My name is Pat Dixon. I'm the first Vice President of the Elementary Occasional Teachers. The purported intent of the new draft PPM is non-biased hiring, revitalization of the teacher force by favoring new teacher graduates and increasing diversity in the hiring pool. This is, in my opinion, a political smokescreen. It's important to note that the former hiring regulation 274, which was revoked, was a superior process in ensuring that hiring was not biased. Seniority-based hiring ensured that hiring was determined by merit, candidates having passed LTO interviews, as well as having attained satisfactory evaluations from our principals, and being placed centrally, not on personal bias in all of its forms. The development of a human rights policy ensures that all are protected from bias and discrimination. As soon as the hiring process is subjective, bias-free hiring becomes null. Subjective hiring is what this new PPM encourages. A bias-free hiring process does not begin with the hiring of OTs to contract positions, but with the interviews to get on the OT roster, recruiting qualified applicants from diverse backgrounds and experiences. Carolyn Tanner educated us on why a human rights policy is essential to all. The proposed policy is not the one to enforce that right. We, OCDSB, want to work with the board to develop a fair and transparent hiring process. The proposed policy does not ensure fair and transparent practices or bias-free hiring. In fact, bias, intentional or otherwise, plays a greater subjective role. I think it's also very important to note that you have a group of occasional teachers who have worked through the process to work up the ranks to become contract teachers. They've passed the hurdles, they've done what needs to be done, and they are now back at the bottom of the heap. You are going to be allowing people from other parts of the province to take precedent over those who have worked with the OCDSB diligently and for long periods of time. Thank you for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you, Ms. Dixon, for that comment. And actually, I had on my list, Trustee Boothby, you did have your hand up. Did you want to speak?
No, thank you. My question was asked by Trustee Campbell.
Okay, thank you very much. And then moving on to Trustee Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a couple of questions. First of all, with regard to section 4.1B, the qualifications and merit section, I just appreciate a little clarity as to whether this is going to be expecting that the greater detail around what kind of lived experiences and other skills and backgrounds and so on, whether that would be in the procedure then, and the policy language would stay broader, so that we wouldn't have to redo the policy every time we discovered there was a different kind of lived experience or work experience that we hadn't included in the first round.
Through you, Chair, the procedure will provide that clarity, for example, through a definition or greater elucidation of what we mean by lived experiences. I think as well, just to be clear, though, that we will not attempt to be too detailed in terms of what some of these selection evaluation criteria would be on a very detailed level, because we wouldn't want to also limit what those might be, but certainly to provide a framework or parameters within which our hiring managers, so largely our principals, would be operating, and ensuring that there's also sufficient guidance in place so that they are ensuring that any criteria that are identified are bona fide, that they are directly connected to the position for which they are seeking to fill.
Thank you for that answer. That was what I was hoping to hear. Second thing relates to section 4.1C, employment mobility. And I just wanted to flag this because I had some difficulty understanding the implications of the language here. What it sounds like when I read it is as though teachers who are relocating here, when they apply, they're all going to be granted an interview no matter what? Was that the intention?
Through you, Chair, the intention is to ensure that there are that the possibility exists that they could be granted an interview without needing to meet any other criteria or any other stipulations. So, for example, the regulation included requirements around which did restrict mobility, and so this is an attempt to address a gap that was in the procedure, but wouldn't guarantee them an interview, but would not prevent them from being interviewed by virtue of the fact that they are coming to us from another location.
I suggest that the language should be modified, because right now the implication is that they would be granted an interview, that there would be no discretion on our part about whether or not to grant the interview. So I think that does need some clarification. Overall, I'm really pleased to see this. I do hope that we will have an extension so that we can have further discussion, and I won't take up any more time tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Trustee Scott. And I am a little bit remiss in that no one has actually moved the recommendation. Would you care to do so?
Through you, Chair.
We are not moving the recommendation tonight,
Oh, it's a
Mr. Chair.
discussion. Okay, yep, it's a discussion. I'm sorry about that. Okay, thank you very much. Then moving on, I did have on my list someone named Adrian Darling, but the hand is down. Did you want to make a comment?
Yes, Chair. My question for Ms. McCoy is the board planning to continue with an OT or an LTO list at all?
Through you, Chair, the intention is certainly to continue with a list of occasional teachers and both at elementary and at secondary. At this point, our thinking is that we would not be continuing with the with the additional list, which is the long-term occasional roster, but would just be maintaining the one list of occasional teachers for each of our elementary and secondary panels.
Okay. Thank you very much. Did you have anything further?
I did have one more comment through you, Chair. If we're not continuing with our LTO roster, what happens to all of those teachers who have been waiting around for years, some of them 5, 6, 7 years, for a contract position who now pretty much have zero standing?
Through you, Chair, I don't think we should presume that that this will prevent those teachers from applying. That anyone who is currently on what was our long-term occasional list that was established under Regulation 274 will be able to apply to vacancies that arise, both long-term occasional assignments and permanent contract teacher assignments, and will be considered based on not only their qualifications under their OCT qualifications, but also the other selection criteria that is established. What will be different is that there won't be the current restrictions in place, which previously would allow principals to only consider the 5 most senior applicants, that any of the applicants on the LTO list or on the OT list who feel they have the qualifications and the additional requirements will be able to apply and will be eligible for consideration.
Okay.
Just a follow-up through you, Chair, on the question of the LTO list. Is that not part of the ministry's PPM that was sent out, that an OT list and an LTO list still be maintained?
So through you, Chair, it's the maintenance of the LTO list is not part of the PPM. It was contemplated as part of the interim hiring policy that was put in place to bridge the time between the repeal of Regulation 274 at the end of October and the time at which boards are required to implement a more permanent hiring policy, but is not part of the PPM. At least it's not part of the draft PPM at this point. We have yet to see the final PPM, but certainly if there are changes in that final document, then we will be reviewing the policy as it currently stands and make any changes that are required to ensure that it aligns with the PPM requirements.
Okay, and I think I have one last question through you, Chair. For hiring, I noticed in the current policy draft documents for OCDSB that principals would, and correct me if I'm wrong here, look at one person who is sort of the senior person on the OT list or something, and then 2 other people. So will they only ever be interviewing 3 people at a time, or will it be all of the qualified candidates that the HR sends them from ATE?
When we think about the number of applicants who are going to be considered, so the first thing is that the requirement to consider the most senior is part of the interim hiring policy that was put in place, but is not part of the PPM. In addition to what's in the policy or the subsequent procedures, however, we will also be mindful of what's in our current collective agreements, and there are some requirements in our collective agreements in terms of, for example, in one case, the number of applicants or the minimum number of applicants that need to be considered. And so those requirements will remain in place, and with every expectation that we will be following those as well. But right now, at least as far as I can recall, there's no minimum number in the PPM as it's currently drafted, but there were some requirements in the interim policy which we're currently following.
Okay, thank you.
And thank you very much for your questions. And we're moving on to Trustee Lyra.
All right, I've got a couple of questions. They're yes/no questions. If you could answer them with a yes or no, that would be great. Has any consideration been given to creating a grandfather clause for those currently on our LTO list?
No.
All right. Is there anything prohibiting us from grandfathering in those currently on our LTO list in the PPM?
Trustee Lyra, I guess I need to understand a little more in terms of what is meant by grandparenting. Is it grandparenting those on the LTO list? And then I would say to what end? To applying the same provisions that were in the regulation, which were again largely centered on giving consideration to the 5 most senior applicants. From our perspective, there would be no reason to retain the list unless there was some intent to provide a privileged consideration to those individuals, which is not contemplated by the PPM.
So from where I'm sitting, we have members on our LTO list who have been there for 3, 4, 5, 6 years, as we've heard today. And they have been operating under the assumption that they will be eligible for contract positions in the future. It sounds to me like we are screwing those who have waited on our list for a number of years and putting them on an equal playing field with people just coming out of university. And it doesn't feel fair to reward loyalty to our district with dropping them to the bottom of the ladder. And so my thought process was, if we created a grandparenting clause for those currently in the LTO list and said we will apply Regulation 274 for everybody currently on our list, and wherever we do not have enough people on our list, let's say our grade 12 physics and French doesn't have a full 5 people, then we will begin to implement the neutral the neutral from straight from university equivalent. And then once everybody who's currently on our LTO list has been grandparented in, it would simply become what is being proposed now.
I think a couple of things to clarify that the absence of Reg 274 and the requirements in that regulation don't mean that the individuals currently on the LTO list are precluded from getting positions. And in fact, one could argue that their experience that they have acquired through their OT experience and their LTO experience will continue to be valued through the hiring process. Part of the difference is that while currently or under Regulation 274, the only requirements that really could be considered were the technical OCT requirements. So there was no ability for principals to look at experiences or other qualifications or criteria beyond the OCT. And so part of the concerns that have been expressed throughout the life of Regulation 274 were that it tied the hands of boards to hire into positions based on considerations that were over and above the technical qualifications, and which again allowed boards to go beyond, to look at a broader pool than the 5 most senior. So I hear what you're saying in terms of your comments and those of from the federations that we heard previously, and understand the concerns of those who are on the list, and through a process that was largely based on seniority, working their way up the line in terms of their seniority. However, I think it's also important to say that boards have always had concerns about being limited to hires that were based largely on seniority. And again, I think we, to some extent, shortchange those who are on our LTO list by presuming that they will not be successful under a broader regime that allows for broader considerations.
If the intent was to hire people who are already at the top of our LTO list, then there would be no problem with the grandfathering clause. If the intent is to leave some of the people who have been on our list for a number of years to not end up in permanent contract positions and instead to hire people more freshly out of school, then it seems clear to me that either we acknowledge that we are intending to do that, or we create some sort of grandfather clause for those who have stood by us for the last number of years. I do not like rewarding loyalty to the district, staying on our list for a number of years, and by my recollection, being paid perhaps less well than a contract position, just because the winds have changed in Toronto, taking advantage of that and dropping them back into the equal pool.
Mr. Chair, I'm sorry.
I would like us to seriously consider a grandfather clause for those who have stood by the district for a number of years.
Through you, Mr. Chair, if I may respond.
Go ahead.
And so I think one of the other ways of looking at it is that the removal of 274 is not intended to disadvantage a particular group of people, but instead is intended to open a space that allows boards to be able to serve students better. And so when it is that we have heard up to today, I had a meeting with a group of students at one of our secondary schools from the Black Excellence Club. And one of the questions they ask, and I have been asked this question repeatedly, is about representation of teachers who reflect their reality. And they asked specifically about Black students and Indigenous students. And so when it is that we recognize that, and this is a question that is asked of our communities, it is asked of our staff regularly, it is asked of me in public and private spaces about what are we actively doing. The challenge is that when it is that we are not able to look at certain populations, certain schools, certain environments, and being able to select with a little bit more robust latitude around serving those students, that becomes then a student service issue. And so a part of the repeal of 274 is not intended to unfairly impact a particular group of educators, but to be able to give some latitude and some fairness around how it is that we are able to serve specific groups of students in specific areas. And so it becomes a focus on student service in that manner. So I do recognize what the trustee is saying, but I think that our core business is around a focus on student well-being, student performance, student engagement, and when it is that we have heard these questions repeatedly asked by students. And in fact, in one scenario, I was asked a very blunt question about why it is that a student who has seen people come for interviews in the office, many people who represent people of color, yet none of these people are ever hired. She asked me in a public space, why is that? And I'm afraid that the answer that says that the regulations don't allow us to is not a satisfactory answer to those students.
Okay, thank you very much. And
I would like to go back on the list.
No problem, we can do that. And we have Ms. Lamba, second time speaker.
Sure, thank you. I just want to say, because this is kind of my area that I do work in. So we have a concept that we call barrier-free seniority. So what that means, you look at, I'm not saying that, I'm just putting it out there, seniority and equity are not contrary to each other, right? What you do is you build in concepts of equity into seniority, which means if we know that historically equity groups don't get, haven't been getting in, so they're at the lowest level of seniority, right? So you give them super seniority to figure out the historical. So they're not necessarily contrary to that, but that's a separate side issue. I just wanted to point that out because I often have these discussions with my coworkers around seniority and equity. But the point that I wanted to point was around accountability. So what I've often seen when you give principals, well, not principals, but just in the hirer, the person who's hiring, a lot of flexibility, right? They can kind of get around some of the criteria and say, yes, they meet this, and hire who they want to. And it's often based on what we call the merit principle. And it's really problematic because it does end up excluding the equity group members. In fact, what this is kind of trying to do has, in fact, if not properly done, not helped equity group members go forward, unless you do things like I had suggested, like designate, right? And make principals and hiring people, whoever's hiring, accountable. What does your school look like? What does your staffing look like? That's why gaps are really important and looking at that. And that's probably going to go into your monitoring and evaluations, but I don't see anything about accountability around that. And with it, you can look at things like, well, are they hiring people who have a lot of experience? Like this, the lists and whatnot, to see if there are any problems going on. So that's just my suggestion on that. I just wanted to talk that seniority and equity are not contrary to each other. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ms. Lamba. And our last speaker before the 10:30 vote, Ms. Dixon, you still had your hand up. Did you wish to speak?
I apologize, Chair. I meant to take it down.
No problem. That's okay. And actually, right now we are at our 10:30 vote, and I would like to call the question on whether we should continue. There are 10 trustees present, so we need 7 affirmative votes to continue past 10:30. And if everyone else could put their hands down, and I'd like to call the question, all those in favor of continuing past 10:30. And opposed? All right, so we're going to continue. That vote passes. And the next on our list was Trustee Lara.
So I believe we can all agree that there are unconscious biases residing within all of us. I do not think it is unreasonable to say that there would be unconscious biases in whomever we decide to make our hiring committee. I have concerns about removing seniority-based hiring, because if we remove seniority-based hiring, those unconscious biases will begin to become once again one of the determining factors about who gets hired and who does not. If we take extra precautions to hire some people from some minoritized groups, and then in doing so bring back opinion-based hiring, I worry about members of other minoritized groups becoming underrepresented. I have a lot of concerns. I don't know if this is the best place to hash them all out, so I'm going to leave it at that. But I look forward to the discussion next week. I'm going to send some emails between now and then. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Trustee Lara. And Mr. Lesage, sorry, my apologies.
Thank you, Chair. Through you. I would like to state a couple of things. I think I hope we're not suggesting that people who are presently on our LTO list, who are into the pool under the reg that's now been replaced, are somehow, they've kind of gotten to where they are simply by kind of marking out time and waiting until inevitably they fell into a contract. Because I think what has to be understood is that they have to go through an incredibly strenuous process to get on the LTO list and stay there. And I think if we say picking from that group prevents us from hiring people that we really want, what we're essentially saying is the hiring that we've done in the last, 8 years since the reg has been in place, 10 years, I'm not sure exactly how long. What we're saying is we haven't done a very good job of hiring, and we wish we hadn't have hired those people. And I know the people in this HR department, there are no jobs that group doesn't do well. So I think we have to have faith in the people that the board has decided to hire and put on the LTO list, and to value the service that they have given to our board. And if we basically put them down to ground zero now, the fear from contract teachers is for our ETFO colleagues who are LTOs, a fear that this also leads to is many of those teachers, I suspect, are going to decide that's the last straw for me. I've gone through the LTO lists. I've gone through the interviews. I'm almost there, and now that's been knocked out from underneath me. I need to find a job that I'm going to have some stability in. I can't be faced with the job of perhaps 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 more years on an OT list for a board who doesn't seem to have respected the time that I've already put in. I think I'm going to go elsewhere. I have to agree with the previous speaker who said, surely there is some way that we can build some grandfathering in to value and respect the time and the service that our LTOs have put in with this board. I think that's the right thing to do. And I would urge that that be put into the policy that eventually gets adopted.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lesage. And I think that completes our speaker list for this item. And thank you very much for everyone's opinion. Seeing no other speakers, we're going to move on to additional item 8.1, report from statutory and other committees. And so the first one is the meeting for SEAC of November the 4th, 2020. And I'd like to call for a mover to confirm the Special Education Advisory minutes of the 4th of November. Trustee Boothby, thank you very much. I know that, are there any errors and or omissions? Seeing none, I'd like to call the question on receipt of those minutes. All those in favor? Opposed? And that passes. Thank you very much. Next item, 8.2. I'd like to call for a mover to confirm the Parent Involvement Committee minutes of 18th of November 2020. Trustee Huff, thank you very much. Are there any errors and or omissions to those minutes? Seeing none, I'd like to call the question. All those in favor of receiving those minutes? Opposed? And that passes. Thank you very much. Moving on. I'd like to call for a mover to confirm the Audit Committee minutes of the 23rd of November 2020. Trustee Jenikins, thank you very much. And are there any errors and or omissions to those minutes? Seeing none, I'd like to call the question on those. All those in favor of receiving those minutes? And opposed? And that passes. Thank you very much. Moving on, report from OPSPA, item 10, and Trustee Boothby, is there an OPSPA report this evening?
Excuse me, Chair. Did you miss the ACE minutes?
It was not on my list.
Again, I'm still looking at the old agenda package. Perhaps it was taken off the new one.
Executive officer, is that, did I miss there? Actually, it's not on the agenda. So moving to a report from OSPA, Trustee Boothby, do you have a report this evening?
Just quickly, Chair, the minutes of the 28th of November were sent out to trustees, and I'll just highlight a couple of things for trustees. One, and I think that we did hear about this in the news, but there were changes to the retired teachers' pension rules. So that is allowing teachers to be redeployed by us for up to 95 days, vice the 50 that was there before. So that's some good news, trying to hire some occasional teachers to help us with some shortages. Another interest of significant concern is that the EQAO are continuing their move to full digitization of the test. So I'm hoping that we look at that and discuss it at SEAC and probably ACE and probably PIC, because it could have some significant issues for some of our students. So we need to keep an eye on that. And the last item that I'll just pass, in light of our discussion here around human rights, OPSPA passed a motion unanimously at this past meeting that we hire somebody to look at our policies and procedures and make sure that they have an anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism lens applied to them. And one last reminder is the Public Education Symposium will go forward on January 28th. It will be virtual. There will be no charge for the symposium, but you do need to register ahead of time so that the different workshops can be populated. The registration has not quite come out yet, I don't believe, but it should be very soon. So January 28th, it's a 10 a.m. start, and it is just for the one day. And that's it, Chair, unless there are any questions.
Thank you very, very much, Trustee Boothby. And we do have one question from Trustee Campbell.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the OSPA report. Just in terms of the OBSPA event, it had been indicated to me by an OBSPA staff member earlier, but I don't know if that's still the case actually, that the workshops will be recorded for those who couldn't attend easily daytime for a later viewing. Is that still the intention?
That is correct. That is the intentions, recognizing that it's a Thursday and many people can't get the time off. So yes, they will be recorded. Okay, great. Thanks.
All right. And seeing no further questions, we're going to move on, but I just did get a note that the ACE minutes, Trustee Ellis, will be ready in the COW meeting in the first COW meeting of January. So that's when we will receive them. So then moving on to item 10.2, new ministry initiatives. And Director, are there any new ministry initiatives?
No new initiatives to share right now. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Madam Director. And OSTA update. Is there an OSTA update, Madam Director?
Thank you, Chair. I'll take that. The OSTA committee met last evening, and we had our AGM with Trustee Ellis and myself confirmed as directors, and I will be taking the role of Vice Chair on. That's it.
Thank you very much. And is there any questions on OSTA? And seeing none, let's move on to new business. Is there any new business? And seeing no new business, I'd like to say thank you very much to everyone tonight, and thank you for your tolerance in allowing me to go to my school council meeting, and I'd like to declare the meeting adjourned.